Millennium, Gehenna, created by Chris Carter. A novelization by Louis Gannett, read by Bill Smitrovich. The two BMWs sped from the Haight past Golden Gate Park. Industrial frat rock music throbbed in the lead car, the bass lines thundering through the windows, the seats, the floor, through five young men with close-cropped hair. Lars drove. Ralph rode shotgun. In back, squeezed between Dylan and Nick, Ito wondered where they were going, what they would do. No one had filled him in on the evening's agenda. Go for a ride, get high, was all Ralph had said. Ito didn't feel great about the outing. Under his companion's rowdy cheer, he sensed a grimness that contradicted the idea of a night on the town. It was making Ito increasingly uneasy. He'd known the others for 7 months now, ever since he'd abandoned his old existence as the son of simple Chechen immigrants. Ever since he'd made the fateful step of joining the organization which one referred to as the Enterprise. Like any 20-year-old suddenly sure he has found his path in life, a path of glory shared with guys his own age, he'd trusted his new brothers, seen them as allies, friends. At first he had. Now Ito wasn't so sure. Not at all sure, in fact. He wondered, a knot of tension tightening in his stomach, if this had to do with his performance at work, with its recent slump. Faith, discipline. Was he slipping? Was he Enterprise material? Above all, could he work the numbers? Those questions, their implications, made Ito afraid. Streetlights strobed the car's windows. Ito stared at the road's dipping curves, unwilling to engage eye contact with Dylan on his left, Nick on his right. The rearview mirror occasionally flared the headlights of the BMW following. Like this one, it was new and full of Enterprise brothers, guys with faith and discipline, guys who work the numbers with brutal efficiency. It's okay, Ito told himself. It's okay. Lars slowed the car, pulled over to the curb. The other car drew up behind. Ito looked out at an expanse of dark grass, black stands of trees. They'd stopped at one of San Francisco's parks, Auburn Memorial Park and Gardens. Not many people around. Ralph opened his door, got out, and headed down the path into the park. Ito watched him merge with foliage and disappear. What now, he wondered. Nick opened a couple of sweating Anchor Steams and passed one to Dylan. They clinked bottles over Ito's lap, toasting each other, then took covert swigs. It wouldn't do to get noticed by the cops, should any be watching the area. Nick leaned into Ito's ear. "Woof," Nick exclaimed. "Woof, woof." "Cut it out," Ito grumbled. This dog game, the barking, was pushing his buttons. The guys had been going at it since they'd left the barracks. What did it mean? He didn't want to know, he realized. Nick punched his arm, handed him an Anchor Steam. "Come on," he said teasingly. "Ito, we're going to have a blast." Ito took a furtive sip, grateful for the beer's calming effect and hoping Nick spoke the truth. He focused on the tune blasting from the car's powerful stereo. "I want to get high, so high." Lars turned to the boys in back. Ito studied Lars' smooth baby face and the hardness in Lars' eyes that wasn't baby-like at all. "The Dark Prince returns," Lars said slyly. Ito looked up. Ralph, rematerializing from the park's murk, was striding toward them. A small foil-wrapped packet glinted in one of his hands. Dark Prince, Ito thought. That's on target. Ralph recently had been made supervisor of the numbers operation. There was a fellow with faith and discipline. Ralph ran his minions ragged. He leaned through the front passenger side window, handed Lars the foil packet, and said in a deliberate, oddly deadpan tone, "Tickets to the horror show." Lars unfolded the packet. A slip of paper lay within. "Yes, indeedy," Lars declared. He peeled off 4 squares and gave them to Ralph, who wheeled away to the second car. Ralph sauntered back, opened his door, dropped into his seat, and slammed the door hard. Then he retrieved from Lars what remained of the perforated strip. Lars put the car in gear and shot from the curb. The car behind followed. Acid, Ito thought, the knot in his stomach twisting tighter. To Ito's left, Dylan twitched. To his right, Nick stirred. Ito wondered if they felt as nervous as he did, if they feared the drug's effect on their mysterious quest, on whatever it was that lay ahead. Ralph extended a finger to Ito, the end digit bearing a square. "Fetch the paper, Ito." He had no choice but to do as he was told, for Ralph's word was law. Then he took the square, put it in his mouth, and chewed. Tasted dirty, bitter. "Woof!" Nick yapped in his right ear. Dylan growled in the left one. Ito closed his eyes. He couldn't take the way Ralph was looking at him, the faint smile on his lips, the cold glow in his gaze. "Good boy, Ito," Ralph softly. "You're real good. Yes, you are." 20 minutes later, Ito started to feel the burn, the corrosive buzz. His stomach, twistier now than ever, seemed to digest itself, eat itself up. They'd driven to a section of the harbor that was inactive even in daytime. Piers and warehouses rolled by, dark, gaunt. Trash ghosted through the streets, an urban flotsam of newspaper, food wrappers, ragged plastic bags. Ito had become much more aware of the bodies flanking him, of the legs and shoulders penning him in. Tight from the beginning, the squeeze was getting oppressive. Breathing took effort. Even the seat back seemed to crowd, to crush from behind. Ito imagined being caught in a garbage compactor. The image didn't do him good. He tried to make it go away, but it gripped his mind, telling him that close quarters were getting closer, closing in. The sensation became unbearable. Ito tried to say something, to alert Lars maybe, tell him to turn off the compactor, flip the switch, anything. But words couldn't escape Ito's mouth. Nothing could escape this pressure. The car swung into a tight left turn. The boys in back tilted, rearranging their points of contact, easing somewhat Ito's sense of confinement. He discovered he could breathe again. Then he discovered that outside the car, the world was spinning, left to right, around and around and around. No, the car was spinning, because it was still turning. Lars was driving in a circle. Industrial walls swept by, the headlights streaking them, streaking across a dirty sign that said, "Acme Dry Cleaning." The headlights rotated these objects around the car. The lights of the other car did the same, turning, painting an encirclement of shabby facades. Abruptly, the movement stopped. The boys in back lurched, took a different tilt. Again, Ito could breathe. The cars had stopped face to face, Ito realized. Across a 10-foot divide, they now vaporized each other with maximum high beams. In the glare, the heads of Ralph and Lars showed up as blots that somehow fizzed and crackled around the edges. Ralph's blot said slowly, menacingly, with all the warmth of an alien invader, "Puppies, it's time to play." From the roof of the derelict Acme dry cleaning plant, through a pair of night vision goggles, watching the young men pile out of the cars, watching them spill into the fire of headlights come eye to eye, watching them stumble giddily, dreamily, through the fire. The face behind the goggles catches a gleam, a faint gleam, thrown from a window slamming shut in its door. Faint, but enough to cast shadow into the pockmarks, into the pits. Enough to illumine, just for an instant, the unearthly gray-yellow pallor. Ito didn't feel on solid ground. The fusion of the car's headlights threw quite a glow, enough to see by, but what Ito saw kept shifting. The pavement was shifting. It felt treacherous, sandy in places, gooey in others. Ito realized something that awed him. The air held numerous mutating substances that he'd never noticed before, but now could see, taste, commingle with for the first time. "Ito!" someone called. The voice rippling the air, Ito blinked. He shook his head and stared at the furnace of light between the cars. His buddies splashed through it like kids at play, yelling, laughing at everything, at nothing. They were calling him over. "Ito, come! Come in the fire!" The fire, thought Ito. Purifying fire. The fire that awaited the weak, the infirm, that would incinerate this corrupt, stupid world. He staggered toward it, entered it, arms outstretched for balance. Ice-white heat, shifting swarms of light. It felt cold, fire. Not burning. Ito moved through unscathed. He took heart from this. He felt deep relief, for the coldness seemed a portent. It told him that, like his companions, he was strong, worthy, a man of faith and discipline. But wait, his companions, Ito gaped. They were howling, barking, baying like hounds. The dog game, he thought with a shiver of panic. His panic mutated into something different, into something like terror. Because the guys' heads, they were taking non-human shapes. Ito watched them become the heads of dogs, hellish dogs, howling, hellish dogs. Their jaws snapped, the fangs gleamed. "They'll eat me," Ito thought. "Devour me whole." One of the dog heads lunged near. Ito smelt its rank breath, felt a scalding spray of spittle, and then suddenly it wasn't a hound coming in for the kill. It was just one of the guys. Dylan, his buddy, Dylan Fortner, putting a human mouth to his ear and whispering, "Hey man, run! Get away while you can!" Ito saw truth in Dylan's eyes, the urgent truth of a warning. He whispered, "What?" Dylan didn't reply. He walked away. The others walked away too, out of the lights. Human now, a sense of finality in their movements. The others were getting in the cars. Time to leave, Ito thought. I'm going with them. However, they were slamming doors. "Wait," Ito said shakily. 7 faces looked at him through the windows, eyes stony, knowing. The car's engines ignited. Then the stereos ignited, sending a throb of bass lines into the night. "Hey!" Ito exclaimed. Both cars backed up with a squeal of tires. Ito stood transfixed in lengthening headlight beams, in a welter of bass lines echoing off the dark buildings. The cars stopped, giving him faint hope. But then one sprang forward, directly toward him. At the last instant it veered, missing Ito by inches. He broke into a dank metallic sweat. Now the other car was coming. It also missed, just barely, leaving Ito weak on his feet, paralyzed with fright. The cars started circling in tandem, like wolves coordinating to torment. The guys leaning out of the windows, yelling, jeering. Ito quaked. His mind slid, drained, lost its wits. Headlights and taillights trailed luminous blurs, spinning a vortex that he knew meant death. He had to take Dylan's advice. He had to run. So he did, in a direction not of his choice. The harrying cars made sure of that. They'd herded him toward Acme Dry Cleaning. Ito darted at it, then into it through a crumbled wall and sought refuge in shadow. His heart pounded. He whimpered, tried to keep a grip on his sanity. Behind him, the demon cars screamed louder. They were storming the place, Ito was sure, seeking the shadow in which he hid. He bolted and ran deeper within. On a catwalk near the high ceiling, through the night vision goggles, watching the terrified boy flee the sound of cars, watching him make his way by moonlight that seeps through glass bricks, shattered windows, watching him stumble toward his destiny, to the place where rust water sprinkles down to the floor. Onward Ito flailed, bumping into things, slipping on grime, junk. A faint light glowed further in. Ito headed to it. He felt safer now, just a little. The car's music was fading. He rounded a corner into a huge empty space. 50 feet overhead, a bare bulb dangled, for some reason lit. Glitter sparkled on the floor beyond. Cautiously, Ito approached the glitter. He found a puddle of discolored water in which lay shards of glass, fragments of mirror. A steady sprinkle pattered into it. Ito looked up to find the source. The sprinkle descended from a broken pipe. Something plopped on his shirt. A stray droplet, rust-colored. Ito saw with a start. Red rain, he thought with fresh fear. A sound echoed in the dark above. The pattering sprinkle muffled it. But Ito was certain he'd heard something. A soft, flapping noise. Bats? He stared upward and shuddered. Something gliding there, hovering. Watching the boy below. Watching him scan the shadows. Face upturned, pale, afraid, helpless, weak, very afraid. Something flitted up there. Ito was sure now, something big. He glimpsed wings. No, they're much too big. But yes, wings. Bat-like membranes, dipping through the dark. A head poised in between. A head with a snout. A hound's head. Ito saw a glimmer of jaundiced eyes. Suddenly the creature dove at him, with taloned claws outstretched, eyes gleaming, the snout bearing fangs, hurtling down, faster and faster. Ito let loose a strangled scream. Closer, closer. The boy's eyes go glassy with shock. His mouth opens wider, screaming louder. Ito crashed into the puddle as the creature hit, his arms flailing to fend off the talons, the monstrous hound-like snout. To no avail, for the jaw possessed infernal power, as did the talons. A great claw pressed into his chest, driving breath from it. The brilliant yellow eyes glared without pity, portals to damnation, to a damned soul. The snout curled, shivered, and bared fangs. With one stroke, it shredded Ito's upper lip. He shrieked, spattering the snout with blood. It continued to savage him, and Ito writhed, his screams penetrating every shadowed corner. But there was nothing he could do, and no one who would come to his aid. The gleaming eyes drew closer. Ito stopped breathing as they inspected his head and what was left of his mouth. Pincer-like talons forced his jaw open. Their tips probed the carnage there with precision, as if looking for something. And they found it. With extraordinary power, they ripped, they yanked. Back they came again, then again. Ito realized something that sent him deeper into the zone of fright. The beast was taking its time, its methodical, surgical time. No rush, no need to wrap things up quickly. Ito would die with excruciating slowness. Faith, he thought. Discipline. I've lost them. Now I'm paying the price. The beast continued its relentless plucking. Summer sun filled the garden of the yellow craftsman-style house. Frank Black descended the porch steps carrying pliers and 2 large light bulbs. He walked across neatly trimmed grass to a ladder propped against the house's side. Up it he climbed, to the motion detector security light he'd installed on the roof's fascia board. It was a good day for this kind of work. Warm, airy, fresh. Fluffball clouds dotted the sky. Nice weather, especially for Seattle. "Hey there!" called a voice from below. Startled, Frank turned. Jack Meredith, Frank's next-door neighbor, stood on the lawn, his broad face beaming. "Saw you working up there," he informed Frank. "Putting in a security light, huh?" Frank smiled faintly. Jack Meredith's early retirement hadn't idled the man. On the contrary, it had given Jack a new career as a full-time busybody. "Yeah," Frank said, his voice soft but penetrating. He started screwing in one of the big bulbs. "Days are going to start getting shorter," he continued. "Lights will be nice for Catherine if she comes home from work late." "Oh," Jack said with interest. "Your wife get her job?" "Yeah," said Frank, putting in the second bulb. "Terrific," Jack exclaimed. "What's the name of what she does again?" "She's a clinical social worker," Frank said patiently, using the pliers to adjust the mounts. The front door swung open. Two bundles of energy sped out. Jordan, Frank's 5-year-old daughter, and Benny, Jordan's puppy. Catherine followed more sedately, her face pleasantly oval, smooth and bright-eyed amid her wavy brown hair. Frank smiled at her. "Frank, you've got a phone call," Catherine told him. She said it casually, but with an edge, in a way indicating to Frank that the call could be important. "Daddy!" Jordan yelled as Frank climbed down the ladder. "Did you make it work yet?" "Almost, honey," Frank said. He stepped onto the grass, winked at Catherine, and entered the house. Catherine gazed at the avidly watching Jack Meredith. "Hi," she said with a somewhat perplexed smile. Jack grinned, pleased that Frank's absence wouldn't put an end to neighborly discourse. "Hi," he said brightly. The phone lay on the counter that divided the hall from the kitchen. Frank picked it up and said, "Hello?" A familiar male voice replied through the earpiece. "Hello, Frank? It's Peter Watts." Frank's grip on the phone tightened. Watts was a member of the Millennium Group, the organization for which Frank did occasional investigative work. "Yes, Peter," he said. Watts said, "I'm down in San Francisco. I've got what could be a multiple homicide here, possibly something a little more involved." Something a little more involved. Frank took a deep breath. Behind him, Catherine was entering the house. He didn't want to say anything or do anything that might give her cause for alarm. To Watts, he said quietly, "You want to send me the details?" "I could do that, Frank," Watts replied. "But the lack of detail has created a high level of concern. I really think we could use you here." Frank heard Catherine come closer behind him. Watts was onto something. Something that Frank, despite the tang of dread in his gut, knew he had to deal with. "Right," he said. "I'll make the arrangements." He hung up and turned. Catherine was watching him. Frank gazed back, sustaining eye contact for several long moments as if to tell his wife that things were okay. But of course, things weren't okay. Awareness of this transferred between them, a wordless understanding born of honesty and tenderness and a great deal of harrowing experience. Catherine didn't flinch. She had learned how to deal with these situations. "Was that someone from the group?" she asked. Frank nodded. "They've got something for me to look at down in San Francisco." "Soon?" Catherine said carefully. Frank moved to the front door. "Yeah," he said. "Right after I finish up wiring that light." Frank Black deplaned the shuttle from Seattle at San Francisco International at 1:53 p.m., 3 hours following his phone conversation with Peter Watts. He drove the expressway into town, then continued past Golden Gate Park to his destination, Auburn Memorial Park and Gardens. From the dog-eared San Francisco tourist guide, he'd learned that Auburn Park had been created in the 30s as a belated memorial to firefighters who had lost their lives in the citywide inferno that followed the Great Quake of 1906. Though modest in scale compared to Golden Gate, a tiny patch, really, Auburn had been endowed with a hefty maintenance fund that the Parks Department and a semi-private memorial foundation administered jointly. The park, therefore, had retained its original character through the fiscal crunches of the previous several decades. The choicest planting was a rose garden, a tract half the size of a football field, which in bloom formed a spectacular expanse of red. The color was intended to evoke fire trucks, and, alas, the flames that had finished off what portions of the city the earthquake hadn't felled. Frank also knew that Auburn Park accommodated pursuits beyond horticulture. At night, it served as a staging area for young love, anonymous sex, and drug dealing. The police didn't generally interfere with these activities. Live and let live was the governing philosophy. The nocturnal denizens could go to hell if they'd wished, as long as they didn't desecrate the gardens. That, however, had changed. Following Peter Watts's directions, Frank pulled into the parking lot of Auburn's maintenance center. The lot already held 3 plain-wrapped cop cars and 4 black and whites. Off to the left, beyond a wooden service shed, lay a field of brilliant red blooms, the rose garden. Uniformed and non-uniformed officials slowly moved through the garden. Yellow police line tape marked off the garden's entire circumference. Outside the tape, knots of onlookers were gathered here and there. Frank ducked under the tape and strode toward a tall, bald, well-built man with a precisely cropped black mustache, Peter Watts. Near him stood a couple of men. Frank's practiced eye identified them as SFPD detectives. To Watts, he said, "Peter." Watts turned. "Frank," he said, his eyes betraying a flicker of relief. The two shook hands. "How was your trip?" Watts asked. "Good," replied Frank. Beyond that one word, he didn't describe his recent experiences or state of mind. Watts and he never wasted time on pleasantries, particularly at a crime scene, that merited their attention. The 2 local detectives, watching with impassive cop eyes, made no move to be introduced. That was typical. People in law enforcement, if familiar with the Millennium Group, tended to keep a respectful distance from its members, no matter how much envy or fear might be in play. "What have you got?" Frank asked Watts. Watts walked deeper into the garden and knelt at the base of a rose bush. Frank followed. To him, Watts said, "Members of the gardening club noticed that ashes were being deposited in the park rose beds over the past few weeks." "Ashes," Frank murmured. Watts nodded. "This morning, a park volunteer, a young woman, came here between 7:15 and 7:30 to put in her weekly contribution. She called the police when she found this." Watts extracted a ballpoint pen from his windbreaker jacket. He used it to part the leaves of a decorative shrub that bordered the rose bed. Frank leaned down to get a look at what the leaves had concealed. Fine, gray ashes covered the ground, freshly deposited from the texture of it. Nestled in the ash, partially buried, was a human ear. Frank sank to his knees to examine it more closely. Ash coated the thing, obscuring its texture and color like an application of makeup. But under the ash, Frank saw blackened edges. This ear had been burned. Scorched, in fact. Basically, only the ridged interior portion remained. "It appears to be adult," Watts was saying. "A good portion of the interior helix is intact. I think we can get a nice impression from the remaining auricle." "Yeah," Frank whispered. Watts said, "There's a lot of ash that's been dumped here, Frank." "How much?" "We don't know yet," Watts replied. "But preliminary estimates, well, a lot." Frank was gazing at the ear so intently he seemed to have lost connection with the rest of the world. This didn't surprise Watts. On the contrary, he expected it, for he'd seen it before. He knew from experience that Frank was assessing a reality that no one else present could see. Still, Frank's concentration, an almost trance-like fix, unsettled Peter Watts. "Fear," Frank said almost inaudibly. The garden receded from his mind. Everything receded. The air became very still. Fire. Intense heat. heat glowing through glass. Pressed against the glass, staring out, a crazed human face. A young man with short hair, a mangled mouth, a bloodied mouth, missing portions of the lips. The boy is screaming. He's in agony, terrified, clawing at the glass. Imprisoned in a fiery hell, this kid is burning alive. The killer watches him burn. "Frank," Watts said. Frank blinked, took a deep breath. Watts said, "The PD thought the ash could be illegal crematory dumping, but when they looked closer, they realized it had been done with care, which doesn't make sense if it's just a random dumping." "No," said Frank. He? Watts asked sharply. "The killer," Frank said. "The killer is the screaming kid, pounding against the glass. But the focus shifts, not on the boy now, on the surface of the glass itself. The glass reflects an image, the reflection of the killer, watching the boy, staring at him." Watts was saying, "He's what, Frank?" Frank closed his eyes, opened them. He turned to Watts and said in a soft, even tone, "The killer knows the victim. He wants him to suffer." "Suffer?" Watts asked blankly. Frank nodded. "You sure about that?" Watts inquired. "Oh, yeah," Frank affirmed. "I'm sure." Watts thought it over. "I think we've got multiple bodies here," he remarked. "Multiple victims." "Yep," said Frank, glancing at the ash covering the rose bed. The powdery gray stuff bordered the bottoms of bushes as far as he could see. Watts asked, "What's he using? A crematory oven of some kind?" "Maybe a crematory," Frank said. "I can't tell. But I do know this. It's important to the killer that he burns them alive." Watts took a quick intake of breath. "Why?" he asked. Frank shook his head. "Don't know," he replied, getting up from his kneeling position. With a heavy sigh, Watts got up too. Both men realized that the detectives had been watching and listening for the last few minutes. Watts told them, "I have a call into a member of our group, a man named Pensieres. If you can help him out with your forensics resources, I think we might be able to get you guys something in the next short while." "We'll do all we can," a stout detective replied, then asked, "Do you see stuff like this all the time?" "No," Frank replied quietly, with a conviction that drew searching stares. "Not like this." Jordan Black giggled helplessly on her bed. Her puppy, Benny, was kissing her ear. Kissing her little 5-year-old ear with great big wet licks. "Ooh," Jordan squealed with delight. "Benny, I love you." Benny replied, licking the ear even more thoroughly. "Okay," called out a familiar, ringingly authoritative voice. Jordan's mother stood in the doorway with her hands on her hips and a mock stern expression on her face. "What's going on here?" Benny stopped the love treatment. The half-grown border collie looked up at Catherine Black with a tongue-lolling smile, the off-center black spot on his head enhancing the puppy's natural loopiness. Catherine almost cracked up. The dog looked like any child's dream companion, and he felt zero guilt. "Benny's giving me kisses," Jordan explained gleefully. "I see," Catherine said. "Well, there's way too much fun going on in here. It's bedtime. Downstairs for you," she said to Benny, easing him off the bed. Benny trotted to the door, tail aloft and wagging. "Bye, Benny," Jordan called. Catherine turned to tuck her daughter in, resuming her mock authoritarian stance, and she said, "And as for you—" "Mommy," Jordan interrupted, her voice taking on a thinner, newly serious quality. Yes, honey? Catherine said, recognizing this tone. When is Daddy coming home? Catherine patted Jordan's head. I don't know, sweetheart. I'm sure he'll be home soon. Maybe tomorrow. Is he working? Yes, Catherine replied. Jordan said, Catching the bad man? Catherine's heart skipped a beat. She said, mustering up her best effort at serenity, If there's a bad man, I'm sure Daddy's going to catch him. Catherine blinked back tears. She didn't want to consider the preservability of innocence. Not now, when beholding the real thing blazing from her child. She turned off the table lamp and moved to the door. She'd almost passed through it when the dimness behind her suddenly brightened. Catherine stopped dead in her tracks. She knew what had raised the room's light level. The brightness came from the windows, from the outdoor security lamp. She moved quickly to the closest window. Sure enough, at the corner of the house under the roof, the security fixture was burning. It cast a ghostly light across the side yard below. Catherine studied the yard. She saw nothing that moved. Jordan's wagon, motionless. Gardening implements, motionless. Plants, a table, sundry objects, all motionless. Really, Catherine told herself, there's nothing there. She felt a little silly. Anxious to get downstairs, she started to turn from the window. Out of the corner of an eye, she glimpsed something subtle, flit through the yard. She froze. Again she stared through the window. She'd seen something. She knew she had. The shadow of something had crossed the yard. A shadow cast by something long and thin, like a pole. Whatever it was, it had moved quickly and steadily, with purpose. Catherine left the room, closed the door, and with quiet haste went downstairs. It was 9:45 in the Enterprise dorm, a quarter hour to lights out. Dylan Fortner lay on his bunk, eyes closed, trying to ignore the clamor that filled the long, high-ceilinged room. Until recently, Dylan had enjoyed this part of the evening. It was the sole time in his daily routine not devoted to labor of one kind or another. Three kinds of labor, actually. The physical workouts of the drill, the mental grind of the education sessions, and most draining by far, the rote labor of working the numbers. There was a fourth kind, too, an umbrella category that included the others. Dylan thought of it as labor of simple survival, what it took to stay alive here. A big workload, all in all, with only an hour of free time to leaven it, 9 to 10. A period to do whatever you wanted before hitting the sack. Take a shower, read comics, just think. But, of course, no TV. Which didn't matter. By 9, everybody was glazed over anyway. No one needed TV. Dylan listened to neighborhood chatter, babble from nearby bunks, the few voices he could make out against the room's background din. He'd heard it all before, in variations or verbatim. Nick Perry, babbling about the jazz concert he'd attended his last night off. Dylan had listened to every detail of that concert at least 5 times. So had everyone else within earshot of Nick's bunk. Didn't it strike anybody as a little strange? Dylan stared at the iron springwork of the bunk above him. One empty bunk up there. Ido Bolov's. Damn you, Dylan muttered at the rusty springwork. He rubbed his eyes, thinking the obvious and hating it. There was no need to add Ido's damnation. That pretty well had been taken care of already. Dylan checked his watch. 9:48 now. 12 minutes to go. 3 guys, new ones in their teens, walked by. Dylan didn't know their names. He wondered when someone new would be assigned the bunk overhead. An eager recruit with dreams of fast cars, wealth, a limitless future. Yet another kid cut off from his past, irrevocably ripped from everything he'd known before. Like me, considered Dylan. Like the rest of us here. And like the rest of us, running the serious risk of not making it through, of failing, losing faith, discipline, losing the respect of the leader, the all-powerful head of the enterprise. That had happened to Ito. And it could happen to me, Dylan thought bleakly. 9:52. Dylan reached under his mattress for the vial that held his stash of pills. He used them sparingly, for they technically were banned. Lately, though, they'd been extra useful, for they guaranteed dreamless sleep. In other words, 7 straight hours of no Ito Bolov. Dylan considered what then would come with the start of a new day. At 5 a.m., the sharp bells would rouse him, would launch him into a massive scramble of dozens of young men donning workout uniforms. That was a good place, too. Early morning, a blur of breakfast and vigorous drills. Too busy to be haunted by Ito. Then came the pre-lunch education session. A wonderful place, that session. A loud place, wild and scary, and inspirational. No room for distractions, lurid as it was with visions of hellfire consuming the planet. Ito didn't stand a chance of barging in there. Then lunch. Sweaty guys shoving high-carb junk into their faces. Minds in apocalyptic afterglow, in thrall to smoldering ashes. The end. Another no entry for Ito. Then the PM education session. Tales of riches and power. The bounty of shattered civilizations flowing to the righteous. To the virile, the pure, the young. In other words, to the brothers of the Enterprise. All the guys loved that. Dylan was no exception. So fuck you, Ito. Don't even think about it. You lost out on riches and power. Because you are dead. That's right. Dead. Then immediately after riches and power, the mandatory showers, which always came as such a relief. Plenty of shampoo and soap and thick, clean towels. The guys gleeful in the steam-filled rooms, images of glory racing through their heads. Mass nakedness, fraternal bonding. Then the sober-up time. The quick hustle into fresh t-shirts and jeans. Focus time. It led to the most important part of the day, the boiler room session. The highest arena for proving faith and discipline. Working the phones. Working the numbers. The numbers, Dylan thought nervously. He used to excel at that. The last few days, though, every now and then Dylan had found himself drifting in the boiler room, not as concentrated as he should be. Then after dinner and the post-dinner videos, the free period. 9 to 10, Dylan's new low point. Unlike every other part of the day, it offered few defenses against fearful speculation. Unstructured, no focus, nothing really to do. It just opened the floodgates. Damn you, Dylan hissed at the bunk above. 9:56. Time to pop the sleeping pill and wait for numbness to banish the mystery that was haunting him. Ito's ear. It shouldn't have survived. It should have been reduced to fine ash, just like the rest of the lughead's body. But it hadn't. Why? Dylan had been asking himself that question since the day before yesterday, when he and 2 others, under cover of early morning darkness, had distributed what was left of Ito Bolov in the rose beds of Auburn Memorial Park and Gardens. During that ritual, Dylan had reached into the plastic-lined burlap sack, expecting to find nothing but flowery powder. Then his hand closed on something that felt like a dried half-pear. He pulled it out, saw what it was. The other guys, eager to get going, didn't see him make the discovery. And Dylan didn't say anything about it. He had his reasons, the chief of which concerned the fact that he'd found the left ear. Dylan harbored a theory about the significance of this, but he scarcely could think it through. Was he going nuts? Making things up? guilty of the same foolishness he'd once seen in Ito? Or had Ito been onto something all along? The whole mess derived from a couple of stories that Ito had told months before. Back in Chechnya, the part of Russia where Ito was born and raised through his early teens, religion played a big role in everyday life. God played a big role. Ito got off on all of that then. He even did a stint as an acolyte in the local church. So it was a major deal when the bishop, making rounds at Ito's little church one Easter Sunday, presented him with a gold crucifix on a chain. Ito wore it around his neck religiously, he'd said with a smile, for 2 or 3 years. Then his parents moved the family to the U.S., and everything changed. Ito swiftly lost interest in church. He developed a liking for pot, fast girls, easy money. He hung with crowds that gradually got wilder. His fashion evolved accordingly. He snipped off the crucifix's chain, turned the cross into an earring, and wore it until he turned 21, on his left ear. Of course, joining the enterprise meant saying goodbye to earrings and leather and chrome chains, all the paraphernalia of Ito's late adolescence. The enterprise favored a clean-cut look. It was nothing if not military in its organization, style, and aims. Joining it was like entering boot camp. Shave your head, get rid of old identities, embrace a new outlook. A kind of conversion experience. Not a half-hearted one either. You definitely had to go all the way. So for multiple reasons, Ito's earring had to go. Dylan and Ito had joined the enterprise at the same time. They shared the double-decker bunk from the start, Ito on top, Dylan on bottom. Occasionally, during the free hour, they would exchange comments about the thrilling but scary world in which they were both initiates. A commonality they soon lost, but which, for a time, bonded them quite closely. It was during such a talk that Ito told Dylan about the crucifix earring. Ito mentioned it because the now naked ear was developing a funny sensation. It felt as if the earring somehow were coming back, growing back. Of course it wasn't, but the feeling didn't go away. Instead, it got stronger. Ito attributed this to some kind of effect in his brain, akin to the phantom limb sensation that amputees experience. He tried to ignore the sensation, and for a few weeks, he mostly did. But then he started noticing something. At times, the earring felt especially there, like it was really there, no joke. The cross hanging heavy as gold. It scared him, badly enough that he couldn't keep it to himself. So he told Dylan about it. The feeling gets intense, man, when I'm near the leader. When he's around, it feels totally real. And if he looks at me, or worse, speaks to me, it hurts. No shit, Dylan. The fucking earring is there, and it hurts. Dylan hadn't taken this seriously. Oh, you're making this up, he remarked with a laugh. Spooking yourself. Just let it go. But now Dylan couldn't let it go. Not after having found the very ear in question, weirdly, inexplicably intact. A sign. A sign of what? Or was he simply losing his mind? Dylan lay on his bunk asking himself those questions, but without feeling the dread that the questions brought to the boiler room, the free hour. In his head, the tendrils of numbness were fattening nicely, taking up more and more space, merging into big blank chunks where nothing ticked and nothing talked. At this point, to his great relief, Dylan couldn't feel much of anything at all. The San Francisco Police Department's Forensic Division occupied a suite of rooms in the downtown Hall of Justice. The centerpiece of the facility, a large lab, held an array of advanced technology, instruments capable of identifying the composition, integrity, and history of virtually any physical object. Skilled technicians tended the lab during daytime hours. At night, however, the lab was generally a quiet place. Such was the case at 10:23 when Frank Black, sitting at a desk in the middle of the room, caught himself once again staring at the phone. Someone knocked on the hallway door. Peter Watts, who was sitting at a light table going over photos of the Auburn Rose Garden scene, went to the door and opened it. A middle-aged man pushed in a hand truck filled with sealed cardboard boxes. Frank rose and approached him. Watts said, "Frank, this is Jim Pensieres. He worked at VICAP just after you left. I don't know if you ever met." Frank shook Pensieres' hand and said, "No. Hi." Pensieres had the full, genial face of a Midwesterner, one lacking the austerity of Frank's features or the nattiness of Watts's trim mustache. "What did you find?" Frank asked with a glance at the cardboard boxes. Pensieres said, "I think we were able to separate out most of what there was in the plant beds." With a cutter, he slit the seals of the box on top. He pulled the flaps open, revealing a sizable quantity of fine, dark gray ash. 39 pounds of carbonized human remains, Pensieres was saying. Roughly the equivalent of 7 adults. Dating is difficult, but there appeared to be a defined stratum, which would indicate more than one deposit. 7 people turned to dust, Watts remarked. "At least 7, said Pensieres. "We have a problem with the Parks Department and the Historical Society that co-administers Auburn Park. The society wants a special investigation, so there's a dispute over jurisdiction and a delay in collecting whatever may still be at the site." "Anything else?" Frank asked. "Well, the remains are clean," Pensieres replied. "By that I mean no uniform, no large fragments apart from the partial ear, which would indicate extreme heat." "Yeah," Frank said, staring at the ash. "Quite extreme," he thought. "About as extreme as heat gets." The face against the glass, eyes blazing terror, his hair smoking, curling, melting. A hand pounds the glass with a final spasm. Death throes. Lifelessly, the hand slides down the glass. Frank blinked and exhaled. Pensieres and Watts were regarding him with interest. Frank asked Pensieres, "What kind of heat are we talking about?" "Bone carbonizes at 1400 degrees, Pensieres said evenly. "But I put this at 2200. Frank nodded. Something was bothering him. He remembered and said, "What about the ear?" Pensieres shrugged. "Shouldn't have survived," he said. "But it did," Frank remarked, half to himself. "Good thing, too," Pensieres said with a satisfied grunt. From a pocket he extracted a plastic evidence bottle. Clear solution filled it, giving a preservative bath to the semi-charred, now ash-free ear. "I don't know how it survived," Pensieres went on, "but we pulled an impression and—" He paused, eyes gleaming both with satisfaction and a degree of perplexity. "Something else, too. Something just as lucky." "What?" Watts demanded. "The tissue contained traces of lysergic acid," Pensieres said quietly. "LSD. Also traces of phosgene, a relatively uncommon gas best known as a byproduct found at accident sites. Most commonly chemical plants using carbon tetrachloride." Frank said, "Dry cleaning fluid." Pensieres nodded. "Yeah, there was an accident at a big dry cleaning facility here 7 years ago. They got a block of abandoned buildings down near Pier 23. Frank glanced at Watts. "Want to take a look?" Watts checked his watch. "It's 10:30, Frank. What can we find now that we won't find tomorrow?" Frank shrugged. "Who knows? I have a feeling about this." He grabbed his jacket and moved to the door. Frank drove. Peter Watts rode shotgun. A steady rain fell, depriving the city of moonlight, rendering the night damply thick. Appropriate conditions, Watts supposed. for visiting a defunct dry cleaning facility. There it is, said Frank, pointing at a dingy sign on the side of the large, dilapidated building. Acme Dry Cleaning, Watts read from the sign. Frank turned into an entry lane that led to an ample, badly paved court well away from the street. Gaunt warehouses, chain-link fences, loading docks, and the dry cleaning plant bordered the court. The only illumination came from security lights shining at an angle from one of the warehouses. Frank parked in the court's center and turned off his headlights. The court's gloom deepened. Rain thrummed onto the car, the pavement, the lifeless buildings. Both men got out of the car with lit flashlights. The two beams crossed swords as they played over Acme's crumbling facade. Frank and Watts headed for it, shoulders hunched against the downpour. They didn't need a door to gain entry. A portion of the front wall had shattered. Frank paused just inside, turned, and used his flashlight to scan the pavement they'd come across. The beam settled on a beer bottle lying on a patch of sodden newsprint, and then moved on to probe the outlines of what lay ahead. Watts's beam scouted the floor. There had been an accident here, all right. The place looked like the casualty of a war zone. 7 years after fire had gutted it, the stench of scorched metal and wood still lingered. Frank moved in slowly, avoiding puddles, tarry patches of oil, smashed bits of mortar work and machinery. Watts followed. Their beams advanced before them, finding few signs of recent human activity. Not much of anything left, Watts commented. His tone suggested little confidence they would hit pay dirt. No, Frank admitted. But he cocked his head as if sensing something. He probed deeper with his flashlight and walked further in. Watts hesitated, then followed. Frank said, Peter, do we know who owns these buildings? The city, Watts replied. They've been for sale for years. No buyers, though. They walked past a bank of charred electrical transformers, glass crunching underfoot. I see light, Frank announced. Around the corner, up ahead. What the hell's the power source? Watts muttered. Don't tell me this wreck still has juice. The light could be coming through a window, Frank said, moving on toward the partition. Behind it stretched a large open space. 40 or 50 feet above floor level, a bare bulb burned. Near it, a thin waterfall poured from somewhere on high, from a ruptured pipe or a leak in the roof. It spattered down through increasingly dim air to the floor into puddles that held glittering shards of glass. Rust-colored puddles, Frank noted. Distinctly reddish. Fragments of shiny glass scattered around. With his flashlight, he probed the ceiling, trying to pinpoint the water's source. The spray diffused the bulb's light, creating a gauzy glare that ran interference with Frank's beam. He couldn't make out much beyond the bulb. Spider webs of catwalks near the ceiling. Girders, rafters, machinery mounts. The catwalk in a shadowed corner. A presence up there? Someone or something watching from it. I don't know, Frank, Watts was saying. What do you think they'd be doing in here? Frank looked down at water falling in reddish puddles. Smaller droplets pattered. Heavier ones plopped. A half-submerged slab of glass caught Frank's eye. Like a mirror, it reflected the gauzy light high overhead, the shadowed dimness behind the light. Frank said quietly, Maybe this is where. He paused. He could feel something coming. He could see it coming in the reflective slab of glass. Hurtling down on wings, the face inhuman, open jaws, fangs gnashing with demonic power, gnashing at a terrified young man, mauling the boy's face, lacerating his lips, his mouth. Frank realized something. He'd seen that face before, burning behind thick glass. Yeah? Watts said. This is where they did what? Frank said. Maybe this is where the victims were subdued. He gazed up at the falling water. at the shadowed catwalk beyond. He listened to droplets hitting, to the patter and plop of reddish drizzle. Bloody rain, he thought. The idea hit him hard. The terrified guy on the floor, flailing in red puddles. The same kid who burned behind a window, trying to fend off the beast. The thing gnashes at his face, his mouth. Unearthly fangs and an unearthly hound-like snout. Fangs not of this world. Red rain falls on the boy, on the beast, on the puddles. A downpour from hell. Frank played his flashlight across the floor. He moved on, sensing the presence of something else here. To his left, he saw a fleck of white, a small white object. Several small white objects, scattered in a shallow pool. "Peter," Frank said, heading to the puddle. He leaned down for a closer look, and Watts joined him. They were looking at 5 human teeth. "Freshly yanked, I'd say," Watts commented, pointing out a filmy fragment of tissue floating on the puddle's surface. "Within the last several days," Frank nodded grimly. "Nice way to subdue a victim," Watts continued. "Hit him with major dental work." A droplet splattered on his head's hairless topside. With a hand he wiped off the moisture and stared at a sepia gleam on his fingers. "Christ," he whispered. "Diluted blood?" "Rust," Frank said. "But the color evokes blood." He gestured at the spray pattering down around them and added in a steelier tone. "The victim suffered over a protracted period of time. The killer set it up that way, carried it out that way. The burning was just the climax." Watts extracted a pair of tongs from his jacket and used them to slip the teeth into an evidence bag. He said, "Red rain at the scene of a catastrophic fire. Whose ritual would that be?" Frank thought about bat wings, about the suggestion of a powerful snout, the preternaturally gnashing fangs. "Can't say," he replied. "It's the ritual of something I've never seen before. Something inhuman, Peter." "A psycho?" Watts asked. "No. This isn't the inhumanity of a crazed human being. It's beyond human." At 8:11, Frank Black was sitting in a breakfast joint sipping coffee and reading the Chronicle. The Rose Garden discovery had made the front page. "Cremated human remains found in park. Evidence of mass homicide. Committee calls for a priority investigation." The story didn't mention the Millennium Group. No surprise there. The group took pains to limit publicity about its activities, and so did the various law enforcement agencies that the group assisted. Generally, the police didn't have a problem with taking credit for solving tough cases, especially when someone with Frank's talent played a role. By-the-book procedure looked more professional than did paranormal detection any day. That suited Frank just fine. The less the public knew about what he did, the less trouble his family would encounter. Catherine and he already had endured their fair share of unwelcome attention, and more. Frank caught himself brooding about the stalker. The Polaroids. The nightmare that had ended his FBI career, and very nearly ended his marriage. The bedrock of his life. He got up, went to a payphone, and called home. His daughter, Jordan, answered. "Hello," she said, her voice morning bright. Frank smiled. With a playful growl, he said, "This is Detective Hound from the Seattle Zoo. I've gotten reports of a young lady teaching her dog secret tricks." "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy," Jordan cried. "How are you, sweetheart?" Frank asked warmly. "Wonderful," Jordan replied. "Where are you?" "San Francisco, honey. Not too far." "Is that where he is?" Jordan inquired. "Who?" Frank asked. "Who are you talking about, Jordan?" "The bad man," Jordan said. Frank winced. He hadn't expected this question. As a matter of fact, he told his daughter, I'm looking for a good man. A man who will help me. What for? Jordan asked with interest. Find a present for a little girl who lives in Seattle. Oh, Jordan exclaimed. Then she said, a trifle scoldingly, Can't you do that by yourself? Frank laughed. I guess I could. Can I talk to Mommy? Yes, Jordan said. Daddy, when are you coming home? Oh, I hope tomorrow. Bye, sweetie. Catherine's voice came on the line. Tomorrow, I take it? Yeah, said Frank. Probably tomorrow. Everything okay? Uh-huh. Frank said, For the record, darling, I'm looking for a good man. In case it comes up. Any progress, Frank? Some. We're getting there. Not as fast as I'd like, but we are making progress. Good, Catherine said cheerfully, as much for Jordan's benefit, Frank knew, as for his. Well, we have to finish up breakfast here and get on with things. Thanks for the call, Frank. I love you. Me too, Jordan squealed in the background. Love you both, Frank said. He hung up and went back to his booth, to the Chronicle, the Park story, the now tepid cup of coffee, and Frank drained the cup and ordered another. At 9 sharp, he entered the forensics lab. There he found Peter Watts gazing through the lens of a large, lighted magnifying instrument. Frank, Watts said by way of greeting. Morning, said Frank. What do you have, Peter? With a gesture, Watts invited him to check out the magnifier. Frank looked through the lighted lens. It was trained on a crowned, somewhat discolored tooth. Watts said, There's a cuspid filling here that's pretty much state-of-the-art. Watts continued, The other fillings are substandard compound amalgam, which indicates something important. Watts crossed to a light table that displayed black and white X-ray blow-ups. They were done somewhere else, Frank said, moving to the light table. Watts nodded. These are 2 root canals done with a process known as N2. They look different here in the X-rays. Frank looked at the gray cores of the images of the teeth. They did, in fact, reveal minute differences in texture. Watts said, You'll see this kind of work coming out of Eastern European countries, out of Russia. I think the poor general condition of the teeth would suggest the latter. Who's running this through records? Frank asked. Pensieres, Watts replied. He's working with the PD on it. The hallway door opened. Pensieres entered and said, Got a surprise for you guys. Frank and Watts knew the man who followed Pensieres through the door. His name was Mike Atkins. With a thick head of white hair, he was a bit older than the others. Well, look who came down from the mountain, Watts said, shaking Atkins' hand. What are you doing here, Mike? Atkins said wryly, I caught the same fish 3 days in a row. Big brown, 5.5 pounds if he's an ounce. Figured the fish and I both needed a day off. He extended his hand to Frank, and they exchanged a firm shake. Good to see you, Atkins said. Thanks for coming on such short notice. It's some case, Frank remarked. He and Atkins maintained steady eye contact. Yeah, Atkins said. A brief silence filled the lab. Pensieres cleared his throat and said, We just need a break on these dental records. Frank, Atkins said, You have a second? Sure, Frank said. The 2 men left the room. Frank Black and Mike Atkins ambled out of the Hall of Justice and down the sidewalk, dodging a stream of excited school kids let loose on recess. Neither man felt a need for immediate talk. Frank knew what was on Atkins' mind. He didn't know the details, however, and anticipated them with a mixture of keen interest and dread. Atkins paused near a shaded public drinking fountain. From his jacket pocket, he removed an envelope. For a moment, he stared at traffic passing by, then he locked eyes with Frank and said, I never told anyone about these, as you'd asked. But I want you to know I was very upset when I opened the package and saw them. I can only imagine how you must have felt. Right, Frank said tonelessly. He took the envelope from Atkins, opened the unsealed flap, and extracted a number of Polaroid photos. He looked at each one in quick succession. They all featured Catherine and Jordan in a grocery store parking lot, loading the van with full brown bags, outside Jordan's kindergarten, dropping her off and picking her up, entering the yellow house. I appreciate you confiding in me, Atkins said. Almost imperceptibly, Frank sighed and said, You're the reason I was even able to come back to work, Mike. That I'm a member of the group. Atkins nodded, absorbing every expressive nuance in Frank's face. He asked, Does Catherine have any idea yet these new photos were taken? Frank shook his head. I never liked to keep anything from her. He paused, not knowing how to put this. Then he said, We're barely settled in. You were right not to, Atkins said. That's your threat assessment? Frank asked. With quiet authority, Atkins said, There's a low risk potential in the photographer escalating from the stalking phase. It's been 3 years since his first mailing, and he's still keeping a safe distance. He doesn't want to be discovered, even though he's followed us to Seattle, Frank pointed out. Atkins said, Well, I'd be more concerned if I thought this was really about Catherine and your daughter. What do you mean? Frank asked with surprise. He sends the photos to you, Frank. The envelope has your name on them. Frank stared at Atkins, his eyebrows tensed. What's the object of terrorism? Atkins asked rhetorically. Terror, Frank said. That's all he wants at this point. Then he's a success, Frank declared. Did you get anything else, Mike? Atkins shook his head. The film was purchased in the state of Washington. Beyond that, he was very careful not to contaminate the film or the package with anything I could pull. Frank's shoulders sagged a touch. Atkins noted this and returned Frank's gaze. Frank said in a probing tone, You come all the way out here just to allay my fears, Mike? Atkins said bluntly, holding nothing back. Yeah, it'd be the easiest thing in the world for you to go home and be with your family right now, Frank. But we need you out here on this one. We need your abilities. I got a bad feeling about this case. Atkins lifted his chin. And I'm sensing you do too. Frank's eyes flickered. He said, I think it's not like any case I've seen before. Atkins cocked his head. Tell me about what you've learned, Frank. Pensier's filled me in on the details as he understands them, but I want your perspective. Frank took a deep breath. Then he described to Atkins much of what he'd seen so far. Frank had lunch with Peter Watts at a Thai place 2 blocks from the Hall of Justice. Jim Pensieres, meantime, was working contacts with the San Francisco area Russian expatriate community. As for Mike Atkins, he had declined to join Frank and Watts for lunch, citing Millennium Group business independent of the Auburn Park case. Watts said over hot and sour shrimp soup, Do you have any idea what Mike's working on? He didn't mention it, Frank replied. I didn't ask. For a minute they consumed soup in silence. Watts then said, Frank, what do you think about requesting a PD stakeout at Acme Dry Cleaning? See if they can catch our dentist in action. I'd say that's a good idea, Frank said, if this were a more straightforward set of circumstances. But it's not. I have a feeling the dentist is wily, that he'd detect that stakeout and avoid it. Frank swallowed the last of his soup and attacked the sole remaining shrimp. But you have a point. He might use Acme again. Something to keep in mind. Watts caught sight of Pensieres entering the restaurant and making a beeline for them. Pensieres didn't take a seat, nor did he say anything. Instead, he tossed a laminated ID card on the table. Frank picked up the card and stared. Petaluma State College ID, with a color photo of a slightly sullen-looking young man. Frank frowned, deepening the grooves that bisected his cheeks. That's him, he muttered. The burn victim. Under his breath, Pensier said exultantly, "Yes, Ido Bolov," Frank said, reading the printed name. To Watts, he said, "Sounds Russian, Peter. I think we have a match." Watts put his soup spoon down. "You got more?" he asked Pensieres. Pensieres nodded. Watts waved for the waiter. Lunch was over. The rental car zipped through midday traffic. Watts drove. Frank rode shotgun, studying the contents of a folder. Police forms and handwritten statements, a variety of paperwork. Pensieres occupied the rear. From it, he said, "The dental records matched the missing persons report 6 months ago. The kid's parents filed it." Mother and father are naturalized citizens, Frank noted, studying a background sheet. Immigrated from Chechnya in 1990 when the son was 15. Kid had a nice rap sheet. B&E. Minor assault, possession. Parents' address is 13235 Liberty Avenue. Watts said sardonically, "Give me liberty, or give me death." Frank turned to Pensieres and asked, "Have the parents been notified?" Pensieres nodded. "PD has officers there now," he said. 11 minutes later, on Liberty Avenue, Watts pulled to the curb behind 2 black and white police cars. Across a small yard stood a modest craftsman-style bungalow. The front door was open. A uniformed officer was waiting outside. 2 others stood in the hall. Frank, Watts, and Pensieres walked to the officer and exchanged brief greetings. Pensieres had something to discuss with the man. Frank and Watts went in the house. The officers inside directed them to the dining room. There they found a heavy-set fellow in his early 50s sitting at the table. He was dressed plainly, but with care. His broad face radiated hurt, confusion, and deep suspicion. "Mr. Bolov?" Frank said. "Yes," said the man, his voice richly accented. "I'm Frank Black. This is Peter Watts." Mr. Bolov nodded without enthusiasm. Frank said respectfully, "We're very sorry about your son. We're trying to find out how this might have happened to him." Bolov said with mournful incredulity, "6 months you couldn't find Ido. Now you want me to help you?" "We're not the police, Mr. Bolov," said in a tone both gentle and grave, a tone that rarely failed to elicit a response. "We believe your son might be one of several victims." Bolov sighed explosively, as if suppressing a curse or tears. "He wouldn't listen to me," he said with sad anger. "Ido had his own ideas, put in his head by those friends of his." Watts asked, "What friends, Mr. Bolov?" "Driving all those German cars," Bolov replied, distaste coloring his voice. "All he could talk about, those cars. Then one day, Ido comes home driving one too." "Do you know where he worked?" Frank asked. "He said he couldn't tell us. He said he was going to be rich." The man glared at Frank, disconsolate, bitter. "This is why we came to America?" Watts cleared his throat and inquired, "Had you heard from him recently?" Bolov stared at nothing for a moment. Reluctantly, he said, "6 months ago, he sent us a letter. A terrible letter. That's when we called the police. My wife," he went on, casting an apprehensive glance down the hallway, "she wanted to burn it. She was so ashamed." Bolov took a 1-page letter from its envelope, which he handed to Frank. "It's in Russian," he said, "if you want me to translate." Frank said, "We wouldn't want to put you through that right now, but thank you for letting us read it." "Mr. Bolov," Watts said, "it would be a big help if we could have a look at that envelope, too." Bolov blinked, as if perplexed. He gave Watts the envelope. "Thank you, sir," Watts said. "Thanks very much," Frank said. "We extend our sympathies to your wife." An hour later, in a darkened conference room off the PD forensics lab, Peter Watts turned on an overhead projector. Ido Bolov's letter. written in Russian in an awkward scrawl, was emblazoned on the wall screen. Watts approached the image and consulted notes he'd made. Then he turned to address Frank and Mike Atkins. They'd occupied chairs facing the screen, their attitude expectant. "The salutation is to his mother," Watts explained. "He is disowning her, cutting the ties that prevent his ascendance to a higher stage." Watts paused, giving emphasis to what came next. "He says his birthrights and all his former worldly possessions have been burned in a sacrificial fire of his new faith," Atkins said crisply. "Cult indoctrination." Watts nodded. "There's a reference," he continued, "to fidelity and duty, and to burning in the fires of Gehenna if he should dishonor himself or his new brothers." Frank stirred in his chair. "Gehenna?" he asked. "Hebrew for hell," Atkins said. Watts pressed on. "He says he's seen the all-powerful one in the pouring red rain and fears nothing but his wrath and vengeance." Frank thought about the waterfall at Acme Dry Cleaning, its patter into reddish puddles, the lunging snout, the fangs, gnashing at Ido Bolov's bloodied face. "The end is coming," Watts further translated. "The numbers have been miscalculated. It says 24 times 15 is 360, adjustable by 286.1. Atkins interrupted. Frank and Watts stared at Atkins with surprise. The white-haired man took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. He said in a tone of quiet scorn, "There's a deliberate error in the Great Pyramid of Giza, an architectural anomaly that some prophets have cited as an error in our calculation of the true calendar year." Atkins smiled grimly. "Some people believe it sets the date of the apocalypse in 1998. From the door, someone interjected, "Plan your investment strategy accordingly." Watts resumed the translation. "He says the weak and the indolent will perish, that he is with his new family now and must renounce his parents as he renounces his belief in anything but the power of the Enterprise." Watts turned off the projector. In the sudden dimness, he said with finality, "And the power of the Enterprise resides in the hearts of the faithful." "And," Frank added, "in the ashes of the dead." Pensieres flipped the wall switch. The room brightened. "Somebody really got into this kid's head," Watts declared. Atkins shifted his chair to get a more direct view of Frank. "I'm not sure he's writing out of real faith," he commented. Frank said, "I think he's writing out of fear." Atkins said with a pensive frown, "The use of the word Gehenna is strange. Its usage is archaic and only found in certain Old Testament translations." He gazed at Frank and added, "Somebody powerful got a hold on this kid. That's for sure." "Or something," Frank said, his eyes hooded. The others exchanged wary glances. "Want to elaborate?" Watts said. Frank said evasively, "We're dealing with a cult. Group psychology, manipulation, indoctrination. Vulnerable people, separated from their families, backgrounds, pasts. It's not just one person who took hold of Ido Bolov. It's an organization." "Cults always have a supreme leader," Pensieres said. He gestured at Ido Bolov's letter. "A Jim Jones, a David Koresh." Kid made a reference to the all-powerful one. "In the pouring red rain," Watts added. "That ring a bell, Frank?" Frank nodded. It certainly did. He sent Mike Atkins a quick glance and said, "I can't speculate about the leader, but I wouldn't be surprised if the cult requires some uniformity of appearance from its members. Short hair, for example. And I think we have to be prepared for the possibility that the organization has considerable resources at its disposal." "What are you hinting at, Frank?" Watts asked. Frank shook his head. He would speculate no further than what he'd already said. Dylan Fortner scarcely listened to the PM education session, despite the fact that the guest lecturer presented an exceptionally vivid rendition of the usual afternoon theme, riches and glory. The lecture drew rapt attention from the audience, not from Dylan, however. At lunch, he'd overheard Ralph Colfax mention to Lars that he was considering a night on the town tonight. To Dylan, that meant one of two things. Either Ralph really did intend to go out somewhere and blow off steam, or someone had been scheduled for termination. An acid-fueled rendezvous with the all-powerful, that is, at the abandoned factory down by the piers. Dylan suspected the latter scenario. Nights on the town were infrequent, carefully regulated events. Yet Ralph and Lars had gone bowling only a few nights before, on the same night that Dylan had helped dispose of Ito's imperfectly powdered body, as a matter of fact. Furthermore, Ralph had sounded vague about his plans. Alarmingly so. A little too vague for him to have followed permission procedure. Thus, the chief question in Dylan's mind was, who is it? Who's been chosen to die tonight? But now he had to wonder, am I next? Hence his inattention to the lecture. Dylan spent the entire hour focused on one subject, the hope that Ralph wouldn't invite him to go for a ride tonight. His focus stayed with him in the shower room after the lecture. Then came the boiler room session. Dylan dressed for it rapidly, trying to psych himself up. Clean clothes, clean skin, clean mind. He'd shine today. He would make things happen. With the others, he filed into the boiler room, a large, cement-walled space that contained 80-odd workstations. They consisted of neatly aligned tables, 3 chairs to a table. Before each chair lay a pad of paper, freshly sharpened pencils, and a telephone. All the chairs faced in the same direction, toward the room's front. Overhead, 3 mirror-surfaced hemispheres gleamed, mounted at intervals in the ceiling down the length of the room. Eyes in the sky, video surveillance pods. At the head of the room stood a large video screen. On it blazed 2 words, create desire. And it's just what I'll do, Dylan told himself as he slid behind his station. For the good of the Enterprise, I will create desire. The room rustled with the readying of pencils and order pads. Ralph Colfax stood up front by the video screen, eyes glued to a wall clock. As the second hand swept to 5 seconds of 3 o'clock sharp, he inhaled deeply. When the second hand hit 12, he barked, "In session!" 6 dozen young hands picked up telephone headpieces and put them to 6 dozen young ears. 6 dozen fingers mashed automatic dial buttons, placing computer-orchestrated calls to a pre-selected pool of numbers. The calls took varying amounts of time to connect. This varied the timing of a soft barrage of words that trained voices directed into dozens of telephone receivers, creating disjunctions in the mass repetition of mantra-like pitch. Hi, my name is Bob Smith. I hope you have a moment, because I have a one-time offer on a new hair product that I think you won't want to pass up. Would you like to try our new product absolutely free? Terrific. I just need your name and address. Oh, and a credit card number for future purchases. Dylan settled into his Bob Smith persona, confident he'd unload tons of shampoo and conditioner. A whole truckload, probably. Words flowed smoothly from his mouth, without a trace of the hesitation and dispiritedness that had plagued him yesterday. No, today's session would go just great. Dylan didn't doubt that at all. He would fill up lots and lots of order forms with neatly penciled information, with neatly penciled numbers. He glanced at the nearest eye in the sky, his sales pitch not faltering. The camera would record a damn fine performance at Station 64, that was for sure. A new legend flashed on screen. Everybody wants beautiful hair. 3 hours into the boiler room session, the wall clock hitting 6 o'clock, Dillon didn't feel entirely on track. He'd filled a few orders, not enough to keep him on great terms with Ralph, however, nor enough to impress the shiny hemispheres overhead. For some reason, the people answering his calls just weren't biting. Why? He pressed the button for another automatic call. Ring, ring, ring. At the station next to Dillon, Lars Svenquist brayed confidently into his phone. Hi, my name is Bob Smith. I hope you have a moment because I have a one-time offer on a new hair care product that I think... Dillon glowered at Lars's smooth baby face, at eyes that knew no worry, at the mouth that worked the numbers, at the hand scribbling down numbers. Suddenly, someone loomed and said, "No new orders written?" Dillon looked up. It was Ralph, of course. To him, Dillon muttered, "Not yet." Ralph gazed down, his expression blank but damning. Dillon stared back, feeling his own face wilt, as if his features were melting, decomposing, burning. Ralph moved along. He didn't say anything, Dillon thought. He just looked at me. "Terrific," Nick Perry was saying 2 stations to Dillon's right. "All I need is your name and address. Oh, and a credit card number for future purchases." Dillon became aware of the fact that the number he had called no longer was ringing. That someone had answered, in fact. A querulous voice was saying, "Hello? Is anybody there?" Dillon mumbled, "Hi, my name is Bob Smith. I hope you have a moment." Dusk was falling when Catherine pulled her minivan into the black residence driveway. The new security light, sensing the van's rolling bulk, ignited. Catherine got out and walked around to the passenger side door. Jordan, inside, was sleeping. "Wake up, sweetie," Catherine said as she opened the door. "We're home." Jordan stirred but didn't wake. Catherine picked her up, closed the door, and carried her daughter to the house's rear entrance. Through the entrance, she passed. Across the street, a man, sitting in a parked car, watched lights go on in the ground floor rooms, and then in the second floor room as well. Minutes later, Benny was watching Catherine put Jordan in bed. Since Jordan clearly wasn't disposed to play tonight, she still was sound asleep, Benny decided to go downstairs. His destination was his water bowl in the kitchen, but instead of making the left turn there, he paused in the front hall. Moments later, Catherine came down the stairs. She saw Benny standing stock still in the hall. "Are you waiting for me?" she asked. Benny didn't move. Catherine noticed that his attention was focused on the front door. She stooped down to pick up mail and said, "You want to go outside?" Benny continued to stare at the door, at its expanse of dark glass. Catherine glanced at the door. Outside, pressed to the glass, stood a dark silhouette. The outlines of a hefty, silent man. A man staring directly at her. Catherine stood rooted to the floor, her heart pounding a staccato machine gun rhythm, her mind perceiving beyond her front door the threats that she'd spent years trying to ward off. All the menace she and Frank had confronted together, the stalker, the Polaroids, the anonymous terror campaign, suddenly had condensed in that looming silhouette. A realization chilled her. Who in the vicinity might help? Whom did she know? Jack Meredith? Not the most reassuring of backups, Jack. Completely alone, Catherine thought. With Jordan. Slowly she stepped backward, running a mental review of items she could use for defense. The umbrella in the corner? No, not heavy enough. Something in the kitchen. Plenty of things. But what? Benny? Forget it. His tail was wagging. The phone. She'd call 911, pray that people got here before the man broke in. Behind the door, a voice rumbled, "Catherine?" Again she froze. For several seconds she stood still, unable to reply. The man tapped the door and said, Catherine, it's Bob Bletcher. Catherine exhaled raggedly. She took a few tentative steps toward the door. Bob? She quavered. Yeah. Menace drained from the dark silhouette. Catherine went to the door, a hand reaching down to get a grip on Benny's collar. Part of her remained in emergency mode. That part saw a need to restrain the puppy just in case he made a lunge for Bob's throat. She opened the door. Lieutenant Bob Bletcher of the Seattle Police Department stood stolidly on the porch, dressed in civilian clothes. Is everything okay? He inquired, concern tinging his voice. Yeah, Catherine replied with somewhat of a gasp. She gazed at Bletcher's gruff, no-nonsense, and entirely unthreatening face. Actually, she confessed, you scared me half to death. Bletcher blinked at her. Oh, I'm sorry, he said in sincerely apologetic tones. I was... Hesitation clouded his eyes, suggesting that he hadn't expected a need to explain himself, and now was groping for a tactful way to do it. Frank gave me a call, asking if I could stop by, he said. I think he was a little worried about you and Jordan. Catherine absorbed Bletcher's comments. Oh, God, she blurted. Bob, I'm sorry. Thank you. We're fine, actually. You're sure? Bletcher asked, his voice doubtful. Catherine nodded. I just wasn't expecting anyone, she went on. Embarrassed, she reacted in a manner so off the mark. She gave Bletcher a wan grin. Would you like to come in, Bob? No, he said briskly. I know you've got your little girl to put to bed. Catherine smiled at him. Thanks, Bob, she said. It's nice of you to stop by. Above and beyond. I really appreciate it. Dylan Fortner stood in the Enterprise cafeteria line, feeling no hunger but trying, as best he could, to keep up a front. He was just one of the guys, tired, like the rest, after another whack at the numbers. To look at him, you couldn't tell he wasn't craving whatever nourishment the institutional caterers had delivered this evening. Chicken pot pie or turkey sausages or Grey London broil. The usual fare, accompanied by mounds of pasta, mashed potatoes. Yes, Dylan looked normal, as if he were anticipating not just dinner, but a little relaxation thereafter. Instructional videos, the free hour from 9 to 10. And then, of course, hitting his bunk. Sleep. Dreamless sleep. But Dylan didn't look forward to any of these things. He knew the pitfalls now. Not even sleep was safe. Nothing was, after today's pitiful performance in the boiler room. He stood in line praying that Ralph wouldn't come over and tell him, casually, or not so casually, that a little ride was in the cards tonight. Someone tapped Dylan on his shoulder. Dylan turned. Ralph stood there, staring at him blankly, unreadably, and Dylan did his best to control a shiver. We need to talk, Ralph said, putting a hand on Dylan's elbow. Dylan stumbled a bit as Ralph guided him away from the food line. Together, they walked clear across the cafeteria to an exit to one of the stairwells. Dylan passed through the door, conscious of puzzled eyes following their progress, wondering what could be going on. Dylan couldn't tell what the hell was up. Whatever it was, it had to be terrible. Dylan knew of no precedent for this kind of ad hoc meeting. Even terminations didn't disrupt routine. Then Dylan understood. Of course, he was about to be terminated. And of course, the termination wouldn't follow procedure. Why? Because Dylan was privy to the procedure. He'd helped carry it out on 4 separate occasions. Unlike Ito and the others, a nighttime visit to Auburn Park wouldn't mystify him, nor would the acid, nor the abandonment ritual at the ruined factory. Dylan was familiar with every last step of the process, which meant, obviously, that a different process was called for. It's simple, Dylan concluded. The leader had told Ralph to get rid of him by some other means. Maybe right here in the stairwell. Ralph put a hand on Dylan's chest and pushed. Dylan didn't resist. He staggered backward until he hit a wall. The hand continued to press. Dylan's back flattened against the wall. His legs and arms did as well, his open palms too. Ralph had him spread-eagled against cold concrete. The hand stopped pressing. Ralph put his own hands to the wall on either side of Dylan's head. He leaned in closer, until their noses were almost touching. His eyes held a gleam. He said, "We have a problem." The gleaming eyes bored into Dylan's eyes. The corners of the mouth turned up, a mirthless smile. The mouth said, "How do we terminate a brother who has terminated others?" Dylan started blinking and couldn't stop. Ralph's face blurred. Everything blurred. Dylan thought he'd pass out. "I'll tell you how we do it," Ralph whispered. "We deceive him. We inform him that someone else requires termination, and that he, the real terminee, will participate." Oh, thought Dylan. Why is he explaining this to me? "Tonight," whispered Ralph. "Tonight, we're performing a termination. You're on the team, Dylan. Any objections?" Curiosity and a strange clarity spread through Dylan's mind. Although he knew the answer perfectly well, he asked, "Who is the terminee?" Ralph's mouth widened with a leer. The mouth said, "You think it's you, don't you?" Dylan stared at Ralph's teeth. "It's not you, Fortner. It's Nick Perry." "Nick?" Dylan muttered. "Yeah, our buddy who keeps reliving a jazz concert over and over. Or didn't you notice?" I noticed," Dylan whispered. "Thought it was strange." "Yeah, well, strange doesn't bother the leader, but crazy does. We don't need crazies here. Do we, Dylan?" "No, Ralph, sure don't. You're not crazy, Dylan. Right?" "No way," Dylan said faintly. "Of course not. We'll leave at 9:30. Me, you, Lars, and Nick in the same car. Like the night we did Edo." "Okay," Dylan said, his head swimming. Who does Nick think is going to get it?" Ralph chuckled. "Why, that would be you, Dylan. Nick thinks the leader wants you." The two BMWs sped from the Haight past Golden Gate Park. Industrial frat rock music throbbed in the lead car, the bass lines thundering through the windows, the seats, the floor, through four young men with close-cropped hair. Lars Svenquist drove. Ralph Colfax rode shotgun. Dylan Fortner and Nick Perry sat in the rear. The music's volume made conversation difficult, which was just as well from the points of view of both Dylan and Nick. Neither wanted to talk, particularly with each other. Dylan had done quite a bit of thinking about the purpose of tonight's mission. Through his abbreviated attendance at dinner, through the video period that followed, and through the free hour after that, like dinner cut short, he'd wrestled with the possibility that in fact it was he, not Nick, who would burn tonight. Why should he believe what Ralph had said? Could Ralph have fingered Nick because Dylan knew what a termination entailed, and might try to resist it? In other words, was the talk in the stairwell just a ploy to lull Dylan into a false sense of security? Maybe. Dylan couldn't deny, though, that the guy sitting next to him was a little crazy. Nick's persistent retelling of the jazz concert experience did smack of loose screws. But then, in Dylan's opinion, none of his Enterprise brothers could claim certifiable sanity. This opinion had taken shape only recently, to be sure, during a time of unusual stress, amid circumstances that Dylan knew full well might have affected his own judgment. He'd even suspected himself of being nuts. At times, he'd been sure of it. Nevertheless, he'd had to wonder about Ralph's claim that the leader could deal with strange, but not with crazy. If Nick really were crazy, so crazy he had to be killed, then to Dylan, it seemed logical that most of his barracks mates deserved death, including, of course, himself, especially himself. And Ralph knew this. He knew that the logic applied just as well to Dylan as to Nick. Obviously he did. He'd seen Dylan behave oddly, do things like sleep through reveille, stare at imaginary messages on the video screen. So yeah, Ralph had grounds for considering Dylan nuts, and of course Ralph knew that Dylan knew this. So what was Ralph doing? Mind torture? Creating horrible suspense? Sharpening punishment in advance? Maybe the leader had told him to set up both Dylan and Nick. Anyway, where was the dividing line between strange and crazy? The more Dylan considered it, the murkier the distinction seemed, especially when applied to brothers of the Enterprise. This line of thought did nothing to bolster Dylan's confidence about his prospects. Much the opposite. At one point during dinner, he concluded that the rationale for Nick's termination was the phoniest story they'd ever heard. Ralph had invented it, that's all. Or the leader had. Mind torture. Turning up the heat in advance. Then again, Nick appeared nervous, which had been giving Dylan hope. The headlights behind him flared in the rearview mirror, sending a wash of light across Nick's face. He stared fixedly ahead, his eyes on the road, but his thoughts elsewhere, or so it seemed to Dylan, who had watched Nick become progressively more absent-minded tonight. At dinner, after the stairwell conversation with Ralph, Dylan had studied Nick closely, looking for signs of jitters, signs of fear. He'd wanted to know if Nick was entertaining the same set of possibilities that he had conceived. Who's really going to get it? Me or him? Twice, Nick met Dylan's gaze. The first time, Nick quickly looked away, his complexion coloring a bit, as if with shame, as if he'd been caught doing something vile, such as thinking, for example, about the fact that later tonight he would help send someone to hell. That didn't reassure Dylan. He knew the feeling. He'd experienced it himself on 4 different occasions, most keenly during the latest one, when he had watched Ito, clueless Ito, consume his final meal. That hadn't been a barrel of laughs. Dylan actually had felt pretty ill. And if Ito had had any idea what lay in store that night, and at dinner had caught Dylan, one of his executioners, staring at him from the next table, Dylan's face probably would have flushed, the same way Nick's face flushed tonight. So no, the reddening complexion hadn't done Dylan any good at all. But this time he and Nick locked eyes. Nick was bringing a spoonful of mashed potatoes to his mouth, a heaping spoonful, quivery, gravy-greased. A split second before its delivery, 2 inches from the mouth, Nick must have felt the stare again, for the spoon froze midair and Nick's eyes flicked, with the mechanical swivel of a doll's eyes, directly at Dylan. But this time, Nick held the gaze, and his face didn't flush. It paled. It went white as a sheet, as if the mind behind it felt sudden, major dread. And for several long seconds, he didn't look away. He seemed paralyzed, in fact, as if terror had seized him, a deer transfixed by oncoming high beams. When Dylan saw this, he thought, Nick's looking at death. And it was Dylan's turn to blush. His face went hot. It grew hotter as he watched the quivery glop of mashed potato slide off Nick's spoon and fall on his lap. Nick's eyes, meanwhile, staying frozen in place, showing no awareness of spilled food, showing only the stark fear of one who knows he's doomed. Dylan broke the eye contact and didn't look at Nick again during the rest of the dinner. But he did look during the videos, and during the 30 minutes of free hour before Ralph ordered them, along with Lars and 5 other guys who'd never participated in a termination before, to assemble in the garage. Dylan didn't make eye contact again. He now lacked the stomach. He just wanted more evidence for something he desperately needed to believe, that Nick feared for his life. Dylan did see more evidence. Nick gradually zombified. He seemed to lose connection with the here and now, to scarcely be aware of anything around him. Dead man walking? Dylan hoped so. Nothing personal, of course. He didn't hate Nick. Not at all. But he also didn't want to play victim tonight. And if Nick had reasons to think that he, Nick, would fill that role, then Dylan could believe just a bit more easily the veracity of what Ralph had said. Who knew? Maybe Nick had screwed up in ways that Dylan hadn't even heard about. Dylan fervently hoped so. The car pulled to the curb, and the second BMW pulled up behind, rousing him from his meditations. Through his window, he surveyed a dark stretch of road, trees, shrubs, a sign marking a dimly lit path. Auburn Memorial Park and Gardens. The place looked different tonight. Dylan and his companions craned necks to get views deeper in. The park's central area, behind a dense screen of trees, was glowing. The rose garden lay in that area. For some reason, bright lights burned there. Public event? A festival? Some kind of police action? At night? Dylan couldn't recall any such event at Auburn Park. Didn't mean they didn't happen, though. Weird, Lars remarked. Ralph stared at the glow, his lips compressed with irritation. Don't think it's a problem, he muttered. Nick, Dylan, you two and Kevin Wainwright were the last ones here, remember? Nick and Dylan nodded. Either of you see anything funny? No, Nick said too quickly. Ralph turned to face Nick, his movement a forceful lurch, his suede jacket squeaking against his seat's leather upholstery. You sure about that? Ralph demanded. Nick nodded with vigor. Ralph stared at Dylan. You? He asked. Dylan had indeed seen something funny the last time he'd been here, but he didn't think it advisable to inform Ralph of that. He shrugged and said as casually as he could, Everything was normal. No lights. Just me, Nick, and Kevin, and the usual scumbags drifting through. Ralph got out of the car and strode down the path. Dylan watched him disappear, praying that the lights in the rose garden were, in fact, a problem. A police sweep, for example, a public safety campaign, a massive effort to drive drug dealers from the park. The idea fascinated Dylan. No acid to jumpstart determination. Unheard of. Acid was what made termination so much fun. So maybe Ralph would call it off. Dylan glanced to his left, and Nick was clasping his hands between his knees. Dylan saw why. Slightly, but perceptibly. Nick was trembling. The poor guy, thought Dylan, feeling both a jolt of empathy and sudden relief. Nick was looking more and more like tonight's main event. But maybe the event wouldn't happen. If Ralph couldn't find acid, Nick might get a reprieve. Nick should run, Dylan found himself thinking. Just open his door, get out, and run. Dylan wondered if he should try to tell Nick that. The same thing he told Ido Bolov outside Acme Dry Cleaning. But Dylan had a problem with giving such advice. He himself wouldn't follow it, even if he were 100% sure he faced death. He recalled the various times he'd considered escape. He'd concluded each time he wouldn't succeed. Couldn't succeed. There was no escape. Not from Gehenna. Ralph walked through the park with a mounting sense of disbelief. Not only was the place a mob scene, it was full of milling people who had no business being there. The object of attention, the cause of all this activity, appeared to be the rose garden itself. Mobile Klieg lights rendered it almost day bright. Cops had cordoned it off. TV cameras pointed at it, as did numerous impassioned fingers. Snatches of talk among passers-by soon gave Ralph a clue to what was going on. No question they're human. Dump trucks, I heard. Did you hear about the leg? Nobody knows, but some people are saying dozens and dozens burned to ashes. Dozens? More like a few hundred. Turning the homeless into fertilizer. Ralph didn't need to hear much more than that. He wheeled away, heading to a spot where he often found what he wanted. The old hippie sat on his regular bench behind a bank of flowering rhododendrons. The half-full moon and the filtered rose garden cliques put a silverish glaze on his wrinkles, his pale ponytail, his ratty embroidered shoulder bag. Ralph waited for him to finish a transaction with 3 feral-looking teens. The kids scooted away in the darkness, excited about their score. Ralph took a seat on the bench. "Busy tonight," he remarked. The hippie snorted. "Ashes to ashes," he said with cheerful indifference. "But life goes on," he added, gesturing at some rose blossoms he'd arranged on the bench. They formed a kind of circular mandala. "Life resurrects, wouldn't you say?" He picked up one of the flowers and offered it to Ralph. "Rose from the dead, my friend." Ralph said coldly, "I'm here for something else." The hippie nodded. "The usual?" he inquired. "Yeah," said Ralph. From his shoulder bag, the hippie extracted a small foil-wrapped packet. Ralph gave him a couple of 20s for it, then got up and asked, "Do you know who's messing with the garden?" "No," replied the hippie with a smile. "What exactly did they find?" "Oh, lots of stories," said the hippie reflectively. "The one I tend to believe concerns a wheelbarrow or 2 of carbonized human bone. Fine ash. Much finer than crematory fine." His eyes flashed with amusement. "And an ear." "What?" Ralph demanded. "Yeah, burned around the edges, intact in the middle," the hippie murmured. "A human ear." "Why?" Ralph said. "I mean, do they know?" The old man shrugged. Just another psychopath." Dillon sat in the car, wondering what was keeping Ralph and what the hell was happening in the park. Lars had turned off the stereo to avoid attracting attention. The relative silence was bringing a bonus, audible comments of passerbys. So far, the voices hadn't yielded much of note, and Dillon found himself listening with greater interest to the sound of Nick's shallow, rapid breathing. A couple hurried from the park, a man and a woman, middle-aged, talking intently. As they passed the car, the woman exclaimed, "Ghoulish as all get out!" Lars turned his baby face to Dillon. "What's bothering her?" he said with innocent blandness. Then his eyebrows rose suggestively, mock ghoulishly. "Shithead," thought Dillon. He listened to Nick's breathing become shallower, quicker. Nick was almost panting. "Ah," said Lars, now gazing at the path to the park. "Speaking of ghouls, the Dark Prince returns." Dillon glimpsed Ralph trotting down the path. He got to the car, stuck his head through the passenger side window, and glared at Dillon and Nick. "No go?" Lars asked him. Ralph didn't reply immediately. The sight of Nick panting, of Dillon sitting stone still, engrossed him. From a pocket he produced the foil packet. He handed it to Lars, continuing to eyeball the occupants of the back seat. He said grimly, "Tickets to the show." The horror show, Dillon thought with a mental twitch. Lars unfolded the packet, examined the strip of perforated paper within, tore off 5 of the small postage stamp-like squares, and with a macabre flourish, deposited the squares in Ralph's waiting palm. Ralph went to the BMW idling behind him, delivered the doses, and returned. He got in, slammed his door hard. Conversationally, he said, "Just found out the most amazing thing." "Yeah?" Lars said, giving Ralph the remaining acid. "Yeah," replied Ralph, his casual tone staying steady. "The city's in an uproar because somebody made a grisly discovery in the rose garden." He turned to look at Nick and Dillon again. "Would you guys know about that?" Neither Nick nor Dylan had an answer to the question. Nick, because he was baffled, Dylan, because his throat was drying. So thoroughly he lost faith in his ability to speak. Lars asked, "You're talking ashes?" "More than ashes," Ralph said. "Something that should have been ashes, but wasn't. It created a problem." Ralph shifted his gaze to the parking brake between the front seats. Indirectly addressing everyone in the car, he said, "Are bells ringing?" In Dylan's mind, bells were tolling. Nick said with startling conviction, "No bells, Ralph. Honest." Of course, thought Dylan. Nick didn't have the faintest idea of what Ralph was talking about. On the other hand, Dylan did. "How big a problem?" Lars said uneasily. A crowd of people streamed from the park, the babble of their voices indistinct but carrying the unmistakable tone of outrage. Ralph stared at them for a few seconds. Then he said, "Someone's been sloppy. I'll tell you one thing. The leader won't be happy." Dylan felt an unexpected stab of guilt. He realized he'd made a mistake. Yeah, the leader now had a problem. Maybe a really big one. And it was Dylan's fault. Ralph leaned in close to Lars's head and started whispering. Dylan tried to make out what Ralph was saying. He couldn't really. Ralph's voice was too low. But once or twice, Dylan thought he heard the word ear. I shouldn't have left it there, Dylan thought with dull self-reproach. It was stupid to leave it there. Of course someone would find it. And of course that would cause an investigation. And of course the investigation would find the ashes. Which of course would cause a public outcry. Of course. Why hadn't he thought of that? Why hadn't he simply put the ear in his pocket, and then dumped the thing in a sewer or something? Then again, Dylan told himself, it wasn't my fault that the ear hadn't burned to ashes, was it? Ralph and Lars continued to whisper. Dylan wondered if they were cooking up a story that would make them innocent in the eyes of the leader, or if they were cooking up a story that would make Dylan look guilty. That seemed pretty likely, especially considering that Dylan was guilty. "Listen, guys," Nick blurted at Ralph and Lars. "I don't know what this problem is. I really don't. And I really hope you're not going to pin it on me." To Dylan, Nick's tone carried an alarming tang of sincerity. Ralph gave Nick an impassive stare, then gave Dylan the same. Dylan started sweating. "Me too," he declared, trying to echo Nick's conviction. Lamely, he added, "Anyway, what is the problem?" Ralph smiled. "Don't worry," he said with a quietness that sounded crafty, bordering on sinister. "Be happy." He studied the acid-laced squares in his hand. "Hey," Nick said, his jaw muscles bunched. "The leader sees through lies. Whatever this is, he'll know I didn't do it. He will. He'll know." "That's right," Dylan muttered. "I'm done for," he thought with despair. "Yeah," Ralph said. "Sure." He licked the tip of a finger, snared an acid dose with the fingertip, and extended it to Nick. "Fetch the paper," he said. Nick shuddered. "Okay," he said. "Let's do it." He tweezered the hit between forefinger and thumb, then jammed it into his mouth, his eyes bright with defiance, and he chewed. Ralph's finger pushed a dose at Dylan. "Cool," Dylan quavered. "Take it," said Ralph. "Yeah," said Dylan, his mind emptying into a cistern of blackness. "No problem, Ralph. I'm innocent. It's not my fault." "Prove it," said Ralph. "Take it." "Sure," Dylan said. "I want 3 hits." Ralph's eyebrows twitched. "That's right," Dylan whispered. "I'm innocent, Ralph. I want 3 hits." "No problem," said Ralph, dabbing up more squares. "Knock yourself out." 10 minutes later, Dylan felt the acid ignite. His stomach burned, his body buzzed, his mind acquired a corrosive fizz. Never before had he taken this much at one time. Oh well, why hold back now? Why hold anything back? Dylan thought about fear. frontiers of fear, places he'd soon would visit, but couldn't begin to imagine. He already felt more afraid than he ever had felt in his entire life. A pure state of mind, without defined boundaries, it promised much more to come. It was inescapable, too. So why fight this? Why not embrace it? Why not heighten the fear? Take it as far as he could, in preparation for the certainty that the leader would take it light years beyond. No real preparation existed for that, of course. But Dylan experienced a curious sensation just thinking about it, a kind of coldly incandescent thrill. Someone once had told him that the root meaning of the word ecstasy was standing outside of oneself. Dylan never had understood that. Stand outside of oneself? What were the kicks there? Now he did understand, for although he faced ecstasy's opposite, its polar negative charge, he indeed seemed outside. Not just of himself, however. He felt terminally out the door, out of this level of existence, through the outermost exits to an enormity that made the car, Ralph, Lars driving, Nick shivering, and yes, himself, seem like special effects, like a poor simulation, dated, irrelevant, fake, about to be turned off. But interesting in its way, in its strange, funny way, Dylan felt a pang of nostalgia for life as he'd known it. Miserable though he'd been lately, sick at heart, his faith and discipline eroding, he'd still remained a fit young man of 22. A guy who might have pulled himself together, gotten savvy, regained focus. Had things gone just a little better, he might even have been cruising into a great future. Riches and glory. The solidarity of his brothers. All that. Instead, what did he have? The back seat of a BMW he'd never ride again. 3 former brothers who now loathed and feared him. A San Francisco night bearing the briny tang of a storm. Dark skies that promised to water somewhere. A bed for his ashes. All of it looking and feeling like a bad computer game, programmed to deliver dead meat called Dylan to a ruined factory building. No wonder he felt outside. The acid, naturally, was enhancing the sensation. The fake car, the fake darkness smearing beyond the windows, the fake guys riding with his own fake body, a body that Dylan was coming to perceive as sitting beside him. All these things were seriously tingling around the edges, not as if they were losing resolution, like a holodeck scene degrading, more as if the generative software were breaking through, fraying the surface, becoming visible, revealing the artifice below the surface, revealing the digital swarm that created this illusion. In other words, revealing the numbers. The numbers. Our empty essence, Dylan. It's what makes us and breaks us. It's all we are in life's big boiler room, and it's a whole lot of nothing. A fantasy that seems solid to the hungry and eager, but which is just a plaything. A huge transparent toy for the ultimate number cruncher. For the being who's got all the numbers. For the thing who soon will demonstrate that mine is up. Then Dylan caught sight of something else. Nick, staring at Dylan. With great effort, Dylan forced his vanishing body to say, "Trouble seeing me, Nick?" The words came out incompletely, like a flawed transmission. Missing digits, low res. Nick said quietly, "I see you." His mouth twitched as he added, "You're dead." "Dead," Dylan whispered. That didn't seem right. Fake, yes. Dead, no. Outside, yes. Gone, no. Evaporating, yes. A corpse, no. Nick pointed at him and said more loudly, "Dead." "I'm disappearing," Dillon informed the idiot. Ralph turned around and regarded the fake occupants of the fake back seat. Headlight beams blazed through the windshield, wreathing his head with a fiery corona. It looked as if he'd acquired a fake crown of flames. Ralph seemed to enjoy it because he smiled. Then he said, "Disappearing? You're not invisible, Dillon. But Nick's right. You are dead." The crown of flames ebbed, faded, leaving an afterglow aura that imparted authority, even reality, to Ralph's staring face. In Dillon, in the teeming fizz that remained, something shuddered. A memory flashed through, replaying a comment that Lars earlier had made. A comment about Ralph, as a matter of fact. Lars had said, "Speaking of ghouls, the Dark Prince returns." Ghoul, thought Dillon with sudden certitude. That's what he is. Ralph's face changed, bringing proof. It wizened, dried, went simian. Cheeks hollowed. The brow, lips, and jaw thickened. Shiny hairs coiled from the nostrils. The eyes lit with a dull, impenetrable glow. "Dead," repeated the ghoul. It grinned, exposing blood-red fangs. This didn't look fake to Dillon. The car still seemed fake. But Ralph, the ghoul, looked very real. And Dillon suddenly knew why. Ralph had traveled to the outside, too. Like Dillon, he'd passed into a new dimension, which meant something terrible. Something really, really bad. Dillon doubted he could make the ghoul go away. He tore his eyes from it and looked at Lars. Lars wasn't driving. Another ghoul sat at the wheel. Stained tusks, matted fur, claws on the wheel, a reek of sulfur. Dillon turned to Nick. He wasn't there either. A third ghoul shared the back seat. Through clenched teeth, tiny and sharp, it hissed at Dillon. Dillon couldn't look at that. Beyond the windows, the darkness sliding by remained fake, clearly not real. But the things in the car weren't fake at all. Dillon knew why. They were escorts with a mission, taking him to the bad place. And they couldn't be stopped. "Dead," hissed the ghoul that used to be Nick. The driving ghoul nodded. "Dead," it agreed. The Ralph ghoul, still staring, chortled. "Very dead," it declared. Dillon raised an arm to fend off the stare, even though his arm couldn't really fend. It wasn't fizzing. His arm, it wasn't evaporating into thin air. Dillon beheld rotten flesh instead. Putrescent, flayed flesh, the bone below exposed. Slimy bone, glistening, pale. The rest of his body looked the same, his chest, his legs, his skeleton feet, everything a mass of horrid decay. A corpse, thought Dillon. I'm dead. The car took a sharp turn to the left. Dillon remembered this turn. It went to the bad place. He looked out and saw he was correct. A peeling sign, whitish against the building's dark hulk, bore words he knew well. Acme Dry Cleaning. Dillon studied the sign. For some reason, it looked real. Then the car, both cars actually, were going around and around, turning, the headlights streaking across industrial facades, seeming to revolve the facades around a pivot, revolve them around the hub of this dream, around its dead core, around the rotting flesh that once went by the name of Dillon Fortner. The turn stopped. Two cars, facing each other across a 10-foot divide, exchanged high-beam glares. From the roof of Acme's ruined plant, through night vision goggles, watching, watching the young men emerge from the cars, watching Ralph Colfax signal the 5 new ones, the initiates, those who had followed, watching those 5. They spill into the fire of headlights, eye to eye. There they form a nest, a snare for Dylan Fortner. Dylan exited the car feeling pretty mobile for a corpse. It confused him. The open air, the dark immensity above, the blazing pool of headlights confused him as well. This wasn't going according to expectations. It pleased him for obscure reasons, reasons he couldn't name, which he knew was stupid. But why not be stupid? Why not take stupidity to its farthest limits? So he smiled, as stupidly as he could, and saw the milling group of guys. Young guys, new ones, Enterprise freshmen. Unlike Ralph, Lars, and Nick, they didn't look ghoulish. They looked demonic, like young, hungry demons. Worse than ghouls, because physically speaking, they appeared quite human. Normal, rugged boys with very short hair. But they weren't what they seemed. Dylan knew this. He knew it from their attitude. These guys had the attitude of fiends from hell. Freshman fiends, that is. Candidate fiends. Dylan knew that these were the worst of all. He'd been one himself, once. A fiend, getting in his very first licks. A tall kid raised a hand, clawed it as if his fingers were talons, and uttered a chilling, crow-like sound. Caw! Caw? Thought Dylan, his vision blurring. Then they were all doing it. Caw! 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 In Dylan's head, comprehension crept in, with reminders of why he was here. He froze, for the first time tonight feeling the sting of raw terror. The caws were puncturing his will like fangs striking skin, injecting venom that stilled every muscle, shriveled any shred of instinct to flee, to resist. So he just stood there, taking it. Caw! Caw! And suddenly the fiends and the ghouls were piling into their respective cars. Doors slammed, windows whirred down, bass lines boomed through the dark factory-lined space. Dylan stood alone in the bath of fire. Tires squealed, the headlights rapidly backed up. The cars started circling in tandem like wolves coordinating the torment. The guys leaning out the windows, yelling, jeering. Dylan quaked as he absorbed this next-to-last stage of his ordeal. His mind slid, drained, lost its wits. Headlights and taillights trailed luminous blurs, spinning a vortex that left him no choice. He was obliged to blunder into the final stage. Obliged to follow the ritual all the way through. And he did, with the blind surrender of a man racing toward a cliff's edge, or leaping from a volcano's lip. He ran at Acme's crumbled front wall. Closer, closer came the shadowed hull, the vast gloom within. Terminal adrenaline propelled him, along with a weird exhilaration of terror, the perfect state of mind for plunging down the tunnel to hell. Through the wall's hole he hurtled, and then he did feel as if he were falling down a tunnel. For although his legs continued to run across a level surface, different geometries ruled this place. Warps of time and space, unlike those of the living world. The plunge got darker. Darker. Dylan crashed into something he didn't expect. It seized him, this thing, that it held him tight in very strong arms. They were the arms of a man Dylan never had seen before. A stranger's arms. They wouldn't let go. Uncontrollably, like a trapped rabbit, Dylan trembled in their grip. Frank Black tightened his hold on the shaking young man. It's all right, he said soothingly. I'm not going to hurt you. It's okay. Kid didn't look so sure. Glassy-eyed, sweating, he stared at Frank as if beholding the devil himself. He seemed extremely confused, unable to think, unable to talk, too, maybe even unable to listen. "Come on," Frank told him firmly. "Let's get out of here. You'd like to do that, wouldn't you?" The kid continued to shake. Frank sensed profound terror, the effects of a powerful drug as well. Neither condition surprised him. Frank was certain that this guy had just recapitulated what Ido Bolov had experienced in his final hours. A good chunk of what Bolov had gone through, that is. Luckily for this one, the process was being cut short. Frank glanced at the dim far recesses of the building's ceiling. Someone, or something, hid up there. A being whose party Frank had crashed. It really was time to go. Frank wrapped a hand around the kid's left arm and half led, half dragged him toward the collapsed wall. After a few steps, his resistance slackened. Frank didn't let go of the arm, however. Almost anything could still happen. The kid might bolt, for instance. Then there remained the possibility, not so terribly far-fetched, that a wing-borne creature might choose to swoop. They emerged from the factory. Frank marched his new charge across the pavement and down an alley to the inconspicuous spot where he had parked the car. From Acme's roof, through the night vision goggles, watching grimly, with scorn, watching the intruder hustle Fortner away. Thwarted, not liking this at all. However, not ready to relinquish. No, not yet. Frank pulled into the SFPD garage and signaled to the officer on duty that he needed assistance. The slim woman approached, taking in the ashen-faced youth slumped on the front seat, taking in his blankly staring eyes, the ribbon of drool trailing from his mouth, the cuffs that restrained his hands. "Book 'em?" the officer asked. Frank shook his head. He studied the woman's badge and said, "Observation room, Officer Trent. Think we could use some coffee up there, along with Mike Atkins, Peter Watts, Jim Pensieres." Asked the desk to make the calls. "Yeah," replied Trent, opening the passenger side door. "Anything anybody needs to know?" Frank thought about that. "Yeah," he said. "Watts should know that I found this guy at Acme Dry Cleaning, in a state of distress." Trent nodded. To the kid, she said, "Come on, buddy. We got business upstairs." The kid didn't move. He gave no sign he'd even heard words. "In space?" Trent remarked. "Needs encouragement," Frank said wearily. "Good tug on the arm. I doubt it'll give you trouble, but you might want." Trent pulled out her cell phone, pressed a speed dial, and said, "Garage, Trent here. Got a zombie, needs escorting." The kid twitched. "Signs of life," Trent said. "What's the name, my man?" As before, she got no reply. Trent pursed her lips thoughtfully. Then with both hands, she grabbed the kid's jacket and hauled him out of the car. Frank crossed his arms on the steering wheel, making an ad hoc pillow for his suddenly aching head. What he'd done tonight was just beginning to sink in. He felt glad to be back here with himself and the kid intact. Relieved, actually, because he hadn't had a clue in advance about what he might find at Acme Dry Cleaning, and had proceeded to find more than he ever could have imagined. The BMWs. The gang of guys with short hair. The terrorization game with the victim rushing to his doom, smacking into Frank instead. All the while, a horrendously vile entity hovering in the rafters overhead. Frank needed a break. He parked the car, left the garage, and headed for a nearby joint that served undistracting fare. Frank entered the observation room's viewing gallery 40 minutes later. Mike Atkins stood there, staring through the big glass window at Watts and Pensieres seated at a table with the subject questioning him. Frank saw at a glance that the interrogation wasn't going well. The subject looked sullen, blank. Watts asked him, voice tinny over the piped-in sound. "How long you been in San Francisco?" "I don't know," replied the kid. "What do you think?" Pensier said, "Come on. What were you doing out there tonight?" "My name is Bob Smith," the kid muttered. Frank turned to Atkins, handing him one of 2 styrofoam cups of coffee he'd brought in. "Anything?" he asked. "Not yet," Atkins said dryly. "He's only giving his name as Bob Smith." He gazed at the boy behind the glass and murmured, "He's saying we're talking to a dead man." Frank offered no comment about that. Atkins looked at him with questioning, penetrating eyes. He asked, "What were you doing out there, Frank?" Frank said quietly, "I went back to satisfy curiosity about what happened there that night." "And?" Atkins pressed. Frank gazed through the glass at the kid, weighing his reply. "I think I know what he's afraid of," he said. Atkins studied Frank's hooded eyes. Decisively, he said, "Then maybe you should talk to him." Frank took a breath and said, "Yeah." A few minutes after Watts and Pensieres left the observation room, Frank went in. Bob Smith didn't meet his eyes. Frank took a seat at the table. The young man turned his chair to a wall, shoulders hunched. He didn't want to be there. He didn't want to talk. Frank could deal with that. He stared and waited. Time passed. The object of Frank's attention became increasingly uncomfortable. Frank finally said, "You've seen it, haven't you?" The question elicited a slow turn of the boy's head. "You've seen its hideous face," Frank continued, "just like Ito did. You've seen the red rain falling in the face of the beast." Frank received a wary, frightened stare. Behind the viewing gallery's one-way glass, Atkins, Watts, and Pensieres exchanged startled glances. "I've seen it too," Frank went on with soft matter-of-factness. "I know why you're afraid." The kid stared at Frank with greater intensity. Frank locked eyes with him, engaging his own particular intensity. Savaging Ito, mangling the face, shredding lips, Ito's face horrified at the fangs hit, red drizzle falling, and something else. Something new. A human figure. Intermittently, a human face. Frank slipped from the vision, back to the pasty-faced boy in the observation room, and he said, "You're safe from it now." The kid's mouth slowly twisted in an incredulous sneer. "No one is safe from it," he declared, a glow in his eyes mingling desperation with the certitude of a fanatic. "You don't know what you're talking about." "How can it touch you here?" Frank asked. The question elicited stony contempt. "What can it do to you here?" Frank pressed on. "You don't understand," Kid muttered, his face quivering. It knows. It knows everything. It knows the numbers." "What numbers?" Frank asked, his pulse quickening. "That's all there is," the kid exclaimed vehemently. "Phone numbers, serial numbers, card numbers. You and everybody else. The numbers are all we are. It knows your numbers, and it knows you." Frank pondered the outburst with growing astonishment. "What does it want?" he asked. "Obedience," Kid blurted, a despairing throb in his voice. "Obedience and control." Frank considered that. "In return for what?" he asked. "To share in the power when the end comes," replied the kid. He grimaced, betraying deep hurt, regret, and anger. "When the everlasting fires rage in the year of destiny," he continued. "When the weak and the indolent perish." Frank remained silent. He wanted more. The kid released a broken sob. His eyes welled with tears. "They told me we were going to be rich," he said bitterly. "That we were the chosen ones. That discipline was the way to our own salvation. Prosperity was power. Tears streamed down his face. They said we could leave whenever we wanted, but it was a lie. No one could leave. It made us turn on each other. In his mind's eye, Frank again glimpsed Ito, writhing, thrashing, blood spattered. The beast assaulting. The winged thing descending like a raptor. Gnashing snout, the fangs, and yes, the human element. A face, wearing some kind of military hardware. Goggles. Night vision goggles. The human face blurs into the face of the beast again. Vicious, greedy, gobbling, relentless. A force before which ordinary human beings are helpless. Utterly hopeless. Frank inhaled deeply. Although he knew the answer to his next question, he asked it anyway. Did it kill Ito Bolov? The kid nodded. Yes, he said, a new timbre in his voice, a note of finality, resignation. His eyes held an otherworldly glint. Slowly he said, because he was weak. Because he lost his discipline, just like the others did. Just like I did. Once you've lost your faith and discipline, it will devour you. Nothing can save you from it. Nothing. Frank wanted to disagree, but the young man was radiating a seriousness that denied contradiction. You can't save me from it, the kid concluded, locking eyes with Frank again. Frank noticed, however, that the eyes weren't focused on him. They were trained on him, yes, but they saw something beyond, way beyond. A reality that neither Frank nor the observation room contained. Then the guy who called himself Bob Smith turned away, as if suffering a seizure. His head shook. Frank noticed he'd stopped breathing, too, and 2 seconds passed. Still he held his breath. Something was going very wrong. The boy's face reddened, his eyes bulged. In the neck, veins stood out like cords. Frank leapt to his feet and grabbed the kid's shoulders. They felt rigid, paralyzed. The jaw was clenched, the mouth tightly compressed. The eyes stared fixedly into some distant place, a place they'd do well to avoid. Hey! Frank shouted, easing the stiffened body to the floor. Atkins, Watts, and Pensieres burst into the room. Get a doctor, Atkins snapped. Pensieres rushed out. Frank tried to pry open the mouth. He couldn't. It felt like carved stone. Feverishly, he loosened the kid's shirt and started administering CPR. Watts leaned down, took the boy's head in his hands. Holy hell, he muttered. What's gotten into him? Frank wailed away on the chest with flattened palms, his face taut with focus, as if through sheer will forcing life into the rigidifying body. Come on, he bellowed. Breathe! But Bob Smith wouldn't breathe. His eyes rolled back, revealing dull whites. Sputum dribbled from his mouth. The head listed, limp. No! Frank shouted. Don't die! Frank, Watts said sharply. Still Frank pressed into the chest. Frank! Watts exclaimed. Oh, my God, Frank muttered. Oh, my God! He's dead, Frank, Watts said. Dead! Frank stared at the corpse with disbelief. I lost him, he whispered. I saved him and lost him. Watts pulled Frank to his feet. Let's go, he said somberly. You did what you could. The next morning, Frank went for a walk in Victory Park, San Francisco's memorial to veterans lost to war. It was a bright, cheerful day, nearly cloudless. The city hummed and honked with the usual AM bustle, briskly striding business people, kids on bikes, ambling tourists. Buses, more buses, the riverine ebb and flow of traffic. Frank paused at the park's tall obelisk monument. He gazed at the 4 flags of the armed service branches, at the U.S. flag fluttering in the center. Insignia of duty to country. Insignia of sacrifice. Of honor. Of ashes. A meeting was scheduled to take place here soon. At the moment, though, Frank felt content to be alone with his thoughts. For several minutes he contemplated the monument. In the far background, the construction crane rose starkly against the sky, a reminder of life's continuity in the shadow of the dead. "Go home, Frank," said a familiar voice. Frank turned to snowy-haired Mike Atkins. The man was regarding him with kindly concern, coupled with the fierce and almost paternal authority that Frank had come to welcome from this colleague, his very dear friend. "I think you should go home," Atkins continued, "and see your family, and get some rest." Frank's face betrayed what was haunting him. He muttered, "That kid died of fright, Mike." "Well, he was so full of LSD, we'll never know what he died of," Atkins replied. "He couldn't escape it," Frank murmured wonderingly. "Whatever it was, what could be so powerful that you couldn't escape it?" Atkins said testily, "What you described in there last night, the face of the beast, I saw it," Frank declared in a low voice that mixed mystification with certitude. "The day I arrived." To which Atkins declared, "I've seen the face of evil, Frank. I've looked into its eyes and seen it staring back at me. But the face has always been a man's face, a human face." Frank remained silent. This wasn't a topic he chose to debate right now. "I've always believed," Atkins went on, "that evil is born in a cold heart and a weak mind." "I have too," Frank said simply. The 2 men gazed at each other. Neither had access to words that could describe what they'd been confronting the previous several days. But in one another's eyes they found re-acknowledgement of a central fact. This case was like nothing they'd ever seen before. A few hours later, Frank was back at home on his long metal ladder adjusting the new security light, intent on preventing false alarms. "Hey there, Frank," piped the insistent voice of Jack Meredith. Frank looked down at his neighbor's broad face. As usual, it was beaming with cheer and unquenchable curiosity. "See you were gone for a few days, huh?" Meredith inquired, his voice probingly high-pitched. "Work?" "Hi, Jack," Frank said patiently. "Yeah, work." "Working with that consulting group you mentioned, huh?" "Yeah." "Consulting," Meredith said. "That's one of those things. You always wondered what exactly that means, you know? Consulting." "Well," said Frank, descending the ladder, "basically we're given a problem and we try to solve it." "Oh, I see," Meredith said avidly. "So, did you solve the problem you were working on, Frank?" Frank gazed at Meredith for several long moments. "No," he said, his eyes clouding the formulation of a reply, taking him elsewhere. "No, I didn't solve it, Jack. I couldn't make sense of it." "Gee," said Meredith, his eyes widening. Frank looked away. Even Jack Meredith could tell that this conversation would go no further. "Well, I'll see you, Frank." Frank smiled vacantly. "Yeah, you will, Jack." That night, getting on toward bedtime, Frank found himself occupied with some reading material he hadn't consulted for quite a while. He sat on the edge of his bed, dressed in the usual sweatpants and t-shirt night gear, thin-rimmed glasses perched on his nose. A hefty book lay on his lap. The Christian Holy Bible. In Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12, he found the passage that caught his eye. "The rulers of the darkness of this world are contending for mastery over the bodies and minds of all members of the human race." Frank pondered the meaning of the message, and he flipped back to a passage he'd consulted earlier in the book of Matthew. Chapter 25, verse 41 read, "Depart from me, ye cursed, into everlasting fire, prepared for the devil and his angels." The words seemed to reach out to Frank, demand his attention. Catherine entered the bedroom, bathrobe clad. "Do you want to say goodnight to Jordan?" she asked. "Yeah," Frank replied, setting the Bible aside. Catherine took note of the title on the book's now exposed cover. "Oh, I hear it's a real potboiler," she remarked. "Full of treachery, death, violence." Absent-mindedly, Frank nodded. "Yeah," he agreed, a rote smile turning up the corners of his mouth. "Looking for moral guidance?" Catherine inquired sweetly. "Or just a little light bedtime reading?" Frank shrugged. "Some answers, I guess," he replied, his features guarded, moody. "Something that happened down in San Francisco." "Anything you want to talk about?" Catherine asked. "I'm just confused about something I thought I understood," Frank said. "Evil. What is it exactly?" "You mean what causes it?" Catherine said, sitting beside Frank on the bed. Frank nodded and said, "It seems the old biblical concept of the devil's influence has lost any currency." Catherine thought about that. "I just think the language has changed," she commented. "I think science and psychology have given us a clearer idea of why people commit evil acts." She sighed. "Oh, I see it every day in my job. Abused kids become abusive adults." Frank glanced at her. "So the true source of evil is us," he said, his tone conveying a trace of doubt. "You mean, are we all capable of it?" Catherine asked. Frank didn't seem to register the question. "Or is there something out there?" He went on quite gravely. "A force or a presence waiting until it can create another murder, another rape, another Holocaust." Catherine blinked. In a deliberative tone that acknowledged the weight of Frank's concerns, she said, "I think it's something everyone who looks deeply at life wonders." Frank gazed at her, troubled. "What would you tell a child? What would I tell Jordan?" For an instant, worry crossed Catherine's face. Then she brightened and said soothingly, "Maybe you should just tell her good night." Frank raised his eyebrows. His wife's down-to-earth guidance appealed to him. Grateful for it, he went to Catherine and gave her a tender kiss. Jordan was asleep when Frank entered her room, but she smiled when Frank leaned down to move her from the bed's edge, pull the covers up to her chin. He rose and stood over her, not quite ready to leave, gazing at his daughter's peaceful face. The sight inspired the first delight and unreserved smile he had experienced in too long a time. Minutes later, Frank switched on the light in his basement office and activated his computer. Idle speculation hadn't prompted the Bible study. Frank couldn't let go of the mystery in San Francisco. He needed answers and was going to do his best to find them. While the machine booted up, he pulled his dictionary from a shelf and flipped through the G's. For the word Gehenna, he found this definition. 1. In the New Testament, hell. 2. A place of burning, torment, or misery. The computer screen lit up with a menu. Frank tapped his keyboard, accessed Search Net, and typed in Gehenna. The phone rang. Slightly startled, Frank checked his watch. Calls at this hour were a little unusual. "Hello," he said into the phone's receiver. "Frank, it's Mike Atkins," said the man with whom Frank had conversed that morning in San Francisco's Victory Park. "I'm sorry to be calling so late." "I'm up working anyway," Frank remarked. "So am I." "Where are you?" Frank asked. "I'm still in San Francisco at the forensics lab," Atkins said. his voice tense. "We got data back on the dead boy earlier tonight. Found something we weren't expecting." "What?" Frank said, swiveling in his chair. "The kid's clothing and tissue showed traces of an insecticide used in the making of something called sarin." Frank said quietly, "Sarin gas?" "Which was used in the terrorist attack on the subway in Japan. The leader of the cult believed to be responsible is on trial for that attack, as well as for several other murders." "Shoko Asahara," Frank said, recalling the case. "Leader of the Shinrikyo." "That's right," Atkins said. "Supreme Truth is the closest translation of the cult's name. Frank, do you know how they say Asahara disposed of his victims?" Frank frowned, his mind suddenly on point. He muttered, "In an industrial-scale microwave." Ito pounding the glass, his agonized face pressed against the glass, his hand going limp, sliding, his hand dropping from view. Frank typed commands on his keyboard, his heart now thudding. Atkins was saying Asahara had amassed over $1 billion. He'd been trying to buy weapons from the Russians. They think he may even been trying to get a hold of the Ebola virus. He wanted to bring on Armageddon, Frank said. "Could it happen here, Frank?" Atkins demanded. Frank didn't know, but the possibility electrified him. So did the internet listing that was scrolling down his computer screen. The last entry read, Gehenna International Pty, Reg Cayman Islands, Industrial Chemical Holdings, New York, Monaco, San Francisco, Tokyo, Sydney, Cairo, storage plants. "Frank," Atkins said, "you there?" "Listen, Mike," Frank said with a sudden urgency. "I just found something. There's a business listing for a Gehenna International. It looks like some kind of offshore holding company." "What do they hold?" Atkins asked. "Industrial products. Chemicals," Frank replied, working his keyboard. "Mike, they list one of their plants in San Francisco." For a fraction of a second, stunned silence came over the line. Then Atkins snapped, "I'm on it." The connection clicked off. Slowly, Frank set down his phone. He stared at the screen, thinking about his find, about Mike Atkins looking into it. Frank suddenly felt extremely uneasy. He picked up his phone again, rapidly punched in a number for SFPD Forensics Lab, and listened to several long rings, unanswered rings. Atkins, evidently, already was out the door. Frank slammed down the phone, leapt to his feet, and ran up 2 flights of stairs to the hallway outside his and Catherine's bedroom. He went through the doorway and paused, his body taut, coiled like a spring. Catherine, sitting in bed reading, gave him a bemused look. "What?" she said. "I don't know," Frank muttered, coming into the room. "I just have a very bad feeling about something." He went to the bedside phone, picked it up, and called San Francisco. Somehow he knew that Atkins would encounter trouble at Gehenna International. The dictionary definition throbbed in his mind. A place of burning, torment, or misery. Catherine stared at Frank with rising alarm. Rain fell in sheets from the dark skies over San Francisco, rendering an industrial district on the outskirts of town more desolate than it otherwise would have been. Mike Atkins never before had driven through the area. He'd made his way here with the aid of a map and an address for Gehenna International, Pty. The factory complex to which the address belonged consisted of several large interconnected buildings. No lights burned in them, or anywhere around them. Atkins saw no signage either. The establishment's anonymity struck him as a little odd. But then, thousands of such complexes existed throughout industrial America, for one reason or another not inclined to advertise their identities, their purposes. Classified government projects, the presence of sensitive materials, security, and public relations. Dozens of issues could motivate management to keep a low profile. The production of sarin gas, for example. 12 people had been killed, and more than 6,000 badly injured during the Tokyo subway attack during the morning rush hour of March 20th, 1995. Large though the toll was, it would have been immensely bigger had the doomsday cult scientists prepared a purer form of sarin, and it was anyone's guess what damage Shinrikyo might have inflicted if it had used even a fraction of its other resources. 2 years later, fresh revelations were continuing to be made concerning a remote ranch in Australia that the cult had owned, which just so happened to have been located near an enormous and quite mysterious explosion that some experts believed to be nuclear. Officials insisted a meteorite caused the blast. Atkins had doubts about that explanation. A tall chain-link fence surrounded the Gehenna complex. Atkins parked by a gate that proved, somewhat to his surprise, to be unlocked. He moved through it with a lit flashlight, ignoring the rain pouring down. Moisture was the least of his concerns right now. Guards and alarms occupied his mind's center court, but he encountered neither. Who or what kept an eye on this place? Perhaps nothing did. A side entry was in fact locked, but only cursorily. Atkins picked it in less than a minute. The entry led to a long, pitch-dark hallway. Atkins probed with his flashlight. Like the building's exterior, the hallway was plain, bare. Just about empty, actually. Midway down the hall, Atkins opened a door and discovered the first evidence of organized activity. A large room was devoid of people, but held row upon row of tables and chairs. Workstations of some kind. All the chairs faced in the same direction. Before each one sat a telephone. At the room's other end, positioned for easy viewing from the chairs, stood a large video monitor. The machine was lit. As Atkins stared at it, words came on screen. Facilitate envy. Atkins's mind raced. He recalled Bob Smith's feverish comments about the numbers, credit card numbers, among others. This is a boiler room, Atkins realized, a place where people pitched sales over the phone. The words on the video monitor changed to, "Work will set you free." Atkins wondered who or what was operating the video system, and why. Were the slogans being displayed for his benefit? They certainly weren't directed to the absent occupants of all these chairs. Uneasily, he glanced around. Still, no sign of any human presence. Objects mounted in the ceiling caught his eye. 3 mirrored hemispheres, placed at intervals along the length of the room. Atkins identified them as video surveillance pods, eyes in the sky. Might they be operational this very minute? Within the closest one, an element glowed. Through the video surveillance system, watching a screen, watching, the white-haired man stared directly into a camera. Watching, unease mount on his face, apprehension, the first stirrings of fear. Atkins decided to move on, investigate a bit further what the complex harbored. Why not? So far, no one was stopping him. He walked back to the hallway, went all the way down it, and followed a covered outdoor walkway to a large adjoining building. A warehouse, from the look of it. That the building was. It comprised a single huge room filled with stacks of product on wooden pallets. Extensive metal shelvings, crammed with goods, partitioned much of the space into a maze of aisles. Atkins couldn't begin to make out the extent of the materials stored here. But one thing was clear. He'd happened across a sizable depot. Down an aisle he moved, using his flashlight to pick out details. A cluster of large steel drums caught his attention. In big letters they were marked flammable. Smaller letters spelled sodium fluoride, a chemical used in the manufacture of insecticide, and sarin gas. Ahead, wooden crates sitting in shelves aroused his curiosity. They bore Chinese characters, and markings, and the words Republic of China. A pry bar lay on a shelf. Atkins used it to pry open one of the lids. The job required some work. With the residue of rain on his face, sweat began to mix. He got the lid off, and underneath lay long packages wrapped in brown craft paper. Atkins caught a whiff of metal-scented oil. He knew this smell. To confirm what he strongly suspected, he slit the paper. Yes, just as he thought. His flashlight beam gleamed on the barrel of a brand-new AK-47 combat rifle. What else was stashed here? Atkins moved on. An armada of SFPD squad cars, 7 plane wraps, and 5 black and whites raced through the night. The sirens weren't on, but whirling rooftop light bars thrashed through the rainy air, clearing traffic from the roads ahead. Peter Watts and Jim Pensieres sat in the rear seat of the lead car, their attitudes edgy, impatient. They didn't know what to expect at the business enterprise named Gehenna International. For this emergency rush to it hadn't been mobilized by information of a solid nature. Something more compelling had accomplished that. A phone call from Seattle. The urgency in Frank Black's voice. Atkins turned a corner in the warehouse labyrinth. His flashlight beam swept across a large metallic cube, 30 feet ahead. A heavy door, about 6 feet tall and slightly ajar, gave access to the thing, which looked to be a machine of some kind. The door held a thick glass window, a viewing port. Atkins advanced on it. He realized that the machine was a jumbo ventilated oven, an industrial microwave, in fact. Flashlight extended. He peered inside. The interior went 6 feet deep. The rearmost area lay a mound of a whitish powdery substance from which extruded objects that appeared more solid. Ashes, Atkins thought with horror. Fragments of bone. Something had abraded the oven's interior wall directly to his right. The surface was scored there, worn down. So too was the inside of the door just below the window. Scratch marks? Atkins speculated grimly. The product of desperate pounding. The cavalcade of police cars tore up to the Gehenna complex and came to a screeching halt. Watts and Pensieres led a scramble of officers through the gate and into the side door. Down the dark hallway they ran, flashlights finding no trace of Atkins, indeed of anyone, in various rooms off the hallway. Watts shouted, "The next building! Come on! Come on!" Atkins moved inside the oven, knelt to more closely examine the apparent bones to the rear. There was a good deal of stuff on the floor. Behind him, the massive door slammed shut. Atkins whirled, hurled his shoulder against the door. It wouldn't budge. "Hey!" he shouted. "Hey!" He continued to pound the door. It was locked, he realized, locked from the outside. He then realized he was pounding on the very area of the door that others had pounded before. A loud hum filled the oven, and bright light as well. The machine was going into operation. Atkins stopped pounding, incredulous that this actually could be happening to him. He felt a blast of heat radiation penetrate him deeply. His eyes widened with terror. Then he saw a dark figure beyond the thick glass window. A man standing there, staring through night vision goggles. Atkins beat on the window with all his might, bellowing from the bottom of his lungs. Watts burst through the covered walkway into the warehouse. To the rear of the enormous shadowy space, he heard a loud hum. Toward it, shouting encouragement, he led Pensieres and the other men. He rounded a corner and saw the big metal cube, the brightly glowing window in its door. "Turn it off!" he yelled as he realized what the humming machine had to be. To it he bolted. He seized the handle and turned, but the handle wouldn't give. Then it did, and the door swung open. Atkins lay in a heap on the oven's floor, his face white, his hair a sweaty aureole, steam rising from his clothes. "Get an ambulance!" Pensier shouted amid the babble of horror and confusion spreading through the men. "Do it, now!" Pensiers and Watts dragged the body out of the oven. "Are we too late?" Pensiers asked anxiously. "Don't know," Watts muttered, leaning over to find a pulse. Atkins's wrist was scalding hot. Watts couldn't find a pulse. Maybe a faint trace of one. Very faint. Behind him, the officer in charge issued terse orders to his personnel. Fan through the complex and secure the place. Then he radioed for backup. Lots of it. "Mike," Watts said with feeling to his limp mentor and friend. "Hold on, Mike. Help's coming, buddy. Hold on." Frank didn't waste time trying to rent a car this late at night. At San Francisco International, he got directly into a cab. The hospital was his primary destination. First, though, he would make a stop at SFPD headquarters. The police had taken into custody an individual he wanted to check out. Rain lashed the cab's windows, providing little relief from Frank's preoccupations. Mike Atkins, the unspeakable thing that had happened to him, the unspeakable entity responsible. The cab stopped a block from the SFPD, unable to get closer due to TV news trucks clogging the street. Frank paid the fare, loped the block, and used a back entrance. In the second-floor corridor outside the observation interrogation room, a wall monitor was tuned to news. The anchor was saying solemnly, "San Francisco law enforcement agencies worked in tense cooperation in the roundup and arrest of what is being referred to as a death cult, whose aim is believed to be nothing less than mass destruction." Frank paused to watch footage of young, short-haired, handcuffed men being taken to police vehicles. Among the prisoners was an older man, grim-faced, sallow-complexioned. The anchor was saying, "The suspected leader is a former chemical engineer named Ricardo Clinet. He's being held on suspicion of murder of at least one cult member." Frank stared at the man's video image. In his stomach, a knot of dread tightened. "Authorities confiscated a large cache of chemical and biological weapons purchased on the global black market," the anchor continued. "Funded by..." Frank pushed into the observation room's viewing gallery. No one was there. Beyond the one-way window, however, an interrogation was in progress. Peter Watts, leaning over the table with his hands flattened on its surface, was questioning Ricardo Clinet. "How many boys died in there?" Watts demanded. "How many kids did you send to their deaths? 10? 20? Clinet ignored Watts. Frank went closer to the window, his gaunt, haunted face reflected from the glass. The image seemed to hover midair next to the prisoner, who stared impassively past Watts, as if Peter weren't even in the room. Watts slammed a hand on the interrogation table and bellowed, "What the hell are you?" Clinet's face showed not the slightest reaction. Disgusted, Watts left the room. Moments later, he joined Frank in the viewing gallery. "Nothing," he muttered. "Absolutely nothing." "I think I know," Frank said quietly. "What?" Watts said. "Who he is," Frank whispered. As if aware of Frank, aware of the lined face and burning eyes reflecting in the viewing gallery's window, Clinet rose from the table, went to the window, and stared through the mirrored surface it presented to him, directly at Frank. Clinet's pockmarked face had a sealed quality, a quality of containment, as if the face were a force field. It held back something ferocious, something explosive. This man's spirit looked to have been laminated so thoroughly that nothing could penetrate it. But plenty could suffer from it, as plenty had. Frank muttered, "I've got to get out of here, Peter." He left the room. At the hospital, in Mike Atkins' room, Frank occupied a chair next to the plastic tented bed, staring bleakly into space. He'd been here for hours. He had no intention of leaving any time soon. Under the clear tent, Mike's face held an unnaturally glistening pallor. He was alive, though, just barely. The door opened. Jim Pensieres poked his head through and said, "Your wife's here." Catherine stood behind Pensieres, looking at her husband with quiet concern. Frank brightened minutely. He rose and went through the door. Pensieres entered the room and took Frank's bedside station. Frank closed the door and said to Catherine, "You didn't have to come." "I wanted to be here," Catherine said tenderly. "I wanted to be here with you, Frank." She touched his arm and added, "I know it's what you fear." "What?" Frank said. "Losing control," replied Catherine. Frank met her eyes and held them, acknowledging the truth of her words as she added, "Having something like this happen to someone you care about?" Frank looked away. "He had serious internal cellular damage from the radiation," he said hollowly. "But the doctors said he's going to pull through." "I know," Catherine said. "And he will," Frank nodded. "I know you know this," Catherine went on, striving to reach Frank and comfort him. "How many other lives you may have saved? How many people could have been hurt by these weapons?" Frank looked away again, bleakness returning to his face, hooding his eyes. "I know," he said without conviction. Catherine moved closer and took his hands. "What you did was important," she said, her voice calm, soothing. "You did what you set out to do, Frank." She squeezed his hands and declared softly, "You caught the bad man." "I'm not sure," Frank muttered, giving his wife a brief glance. "Not sure of what?" Catherine asked. "Not sure," Frank murmured. Again he glanced at Catherine, and again he turned away, his eyebrows knitting. "Not sure," he finally said, "if the bad man can be caught." Catherine considered the statement, her eyes filling with concern, and then with understanding. Frank put his arms around her. They hugged tightly, for the moment joined, completing each other, their embrace removing them from the harshly lit hospital corridor, from this place of cold facts and final uncertainties, taking them away, for the moment, from the suffering, from the horror.
We hope you've enjoyed this program from Harper Audio. To order additional cassettes or to receive a complete catalog of Harper Audio and Cadman titles, please call us at 1-800-331-3761. That's 1-800-331-3761. Thank you.